14 centuries before Christ, the desert burned brighter than it ever had. In the heart of Egypt, one man stood beneath the sun and declared that there was no god but light itself. His name was Akhenaten, a pharaoh, a poet, a heretic. He tore down the temples of 1,000 gods, silenced the chants of priests who had ruled for millennia, and built a city devoted to the Aten, the sun disk, giver of life. Yet within a generation his name was chiselled from every wall, his statues smashed, his faith erased. What kind of revelation could burn so brightly it blinded an empire? Was Akhenaten the world's first monotheist, or just the last dreamer of a dying age? To understand the revolution that Akhenaten brought to Egypt, we must first understand the world he inherited, a world so different from our own that it challenges our very conception of religious belief. This was Egypt at the height of the 18th dynasty, during the reign of Amenhotep III, a time when the empire stretched from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates in the north, when gold flowed from conquered lands like water, and when the gods walked among men in ways we can scarcely imagine today. Egypt in the mid-14th century BCE was not merely a kingdom, it was a divine machine, an intricate apparatus designed to maintain cosmic order through ritual, sacrifice, and the endless repetition of sacred formulae. The concept of Ma'at, truth, justice, cosmic balance, permeated every aspect of existence. The pharaoh was not simply a political leader, but the living embodiment of Horus, the bridge between heaven and earth, responsible for maintaining the delicate equilibrium that kept chaos at bay. The pantheon that governed this world was vast and complex beyond measure. At its apex stood Amun-Ra, the hidden one who had merged with the sun god Ra to become the king of gods. His temple complex at Karnak covered over 200 acres, a forest of columns reaching toward the sky, each one inscribed with hymns and prayers accumulated over centuries. The air within these sacred precincts was thick with incense, frankincense from Punt, myrrh from distant shores, that hung in shafts of light filtering through high windows, creating an atmosphere that seemed to exist outside normal time. But Amun was not alone. There was Ptah, the craftsman god of Memphis, who spoke the world into being through divine utterance. There was Osiris, lord of the dead, who judged every soul in the afterlife and promised eternal life to the righteous. There was his wife Isis, the Great Mother, whose magic was so powerful that she had once tricked Ra himself into revealing his secret name. There was Horus the falcon, Hathor the cow goddess of love and joy, Thoth the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, Anubis the jackal who guided souls through the underworld, Sobek the crocodile, Bastet the cat, and hundreds upon hundreds of others, local deities, household gods, demons, and protective spirits that filled every corner of Egyptian consciousness. Each of these gods had their temples, their priests, their festivals, their sacred animals, their particular forms of worship. The calendar was a continuous round of holy days, processions, offerings, and ceremonies. In Thebes alone, the festivals of Amun required the participation of thousands of priests, singers, dancers, and temple workers. The god statue would be carried forth from the inner sanctuary on a golden bark, paraded through the streets while the people prostrated themselves and sang hymns that had been old when the pyramids were young. The priesthood of Amun had become an institution unto itself, wielding power that rivaled even that of the pharaoh. They controlled vast estates, employed tens of thousands of workers, collected taxes, administered justice, and influenced every aspect of state policy. The high priest of Amun was second only to the king in authority, and there were whispers, always whispers in the corridors of power, that the priests had grown too mighty, that they had forgotten they were servants of the god rather than masters in their own right. Into this world of divine abundance and ritual complexity was born a prince who would change everything. He came into the world as Amenhotep, named after his father, the fourth to bear that name. We know little of his childhood, only fragments and hints preserved in later inscriptions. He was not the firstborn son, That honour belonged to his older brother Thutmose, who was being groomed for kingship and who served as high priest of Ptah in Memphis. But fate, or perhaps the gods, had other plans. Thutmose died young for reasons lost to history, and suddenly the younger prince found himself heir to the greatest empire on earth. What kind of child was he? The physical evidence suggests something unusual. The art of his later reign depicts him with an elongated skull, a protruding belly, wide hips and spindly limbs, features so distinctive that scholars have debated for over a century whether they represent realistic portraiture or symbolic religious imagery. Some have suggested he suffered from Marfan syndrome or Froelich syndrome, genetic conditions that could explain his unusual appearance. Others argue that the artistic style was intentional, a way of depicting the king as transcending normal human categories, as being neither fully male nor female but something beyond, something divine. But physical appearance aside, what shaped the young prince's mind? He grew up in the palace of Malkata, his father's great complex on the west bank of Thebes. Here he would have been educated by the finest scholars in the kingdom, learning to read and write the complex hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts, studying mathematics and astronomy, memorizing the traditional hymns and prayers, learning the intricate protocols of kingship. He would have participated in countless religious ceremonies, watched his father perform the daily ritual of awakening and feeding the gods, seen the endless processions and festivals that mark the Egyptian year. Yet something in all this magnificence seems to have troubled him. Perhaps it was the sheer multiplicity of deities, the way worship had become bureaucratized into routine, the distance between the profound mysteries the priests claim to serve and the mundane politics that actually govern temple life. Perhaps he sensed the growing tension between the priesthood's power and the pharaoh's authority. Or perhaps, and this is something we can never truly know, he experienced something more direct, more personal. Perhaps in the brilliant Egyptian sunlight, in the moment when the sun disk broke over the eastern horizon and flooded the world with radiance, he felt something that others did not. Perhaps he heard what others refused to hear. Egypt under Amenhotep III was at its zenith, but it was also a world approaching transformation. The traditional structures that had sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia were beginning to show subtle signs of strain. The empire was vast but difficult to manage. The priesthoods were wealthy but sometimes at odds with royal authority. The old certainties were still in place, but a sensitive observer might have detected the first faint tremors of coming change. The young prince watched and waited, surrounded by the golden splendour of Thebes, by the chanting of priests in darkened temples, by the smell of incense and the glitter of gold leaf on 1,000 divine statues. He watched the sun rise and set, day after day, year after year, and something within him began to shift, to crystallize into a vision that would shake the foundations of the oldest civilization on earth. When Amenhotep III died after a reign of nearly 40 years, his son ascended to the throne as Amenhotep IV. The coronation followed all the ancient protocols, the rituals that had been performed for Pharaoh since the dawn of Egyptian history. The young king received the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the crook and flail that symbolized his role as shepherd of his people. He was proclaimed as Horus, the living god, the son of Ra, the embodiment of divine authority on earth. For the first few years of his reign, everything appeared normal. Amenhotep IV performed the expected duties of kingship. He made offerings to the traditional gods, including Amun. He commissioned buildings at Karnak. He maintained the diplomatic relationships his father had established with foreign powers. Court life continued in its accustomed patterns. If the young pharaoh harboured unusual religious ideas, he kept them largely private, shared perhaps only with his closest advisers and with the remarkable woman who became his great royal wife, Nefertiti, whose name means "the beautiful one has come." But beneath the surface of conventional piety, something radical was taking shape. The new king began to show increasing attention to a deity that had existed in the Egyptian pantheon for centuries but had never before been elevated to such prominence: the Aten, the physical disk of the sun itself. The Aten was not Amenhotep IV's invention. References to the sun disk appear in Egyptian texts going back to the Middle Kingdom and probably earlier. During the reign of Amenhotep III, the Aten had already been receiving enhanced attention. Scarabs and inscriptions from the previous reign mention the Aten with reverence, sometimes in context that suggests the sun disk was being understood as more than just another aspect of Ra. Some scholars have suggested that Amenhotep III himself had been moving toward a form of solar henotheism, not quite monotheism, but a focus on one supreme deity without necessarily denying the existence of others. What made Amenhotep IV different was the radical conclusion he drew from this solar theology. He did not merely elevate the Aten above other gods. He came to believe that the Aten alone was real, that all the other deities worshipped by his people for thousands of years were nothing. Not lesser gods, not aspects of the one true God, but simply false shadows and illusions that had led humanity astray. This was an idea with virtually no precedent in the ancient world. The standard mode of ancient religious thought was polytheistic and syncretistic. When different cultures encountered each other, they typically identified their gods with those of their neighbours. The Greeks called the Egyptian Amun Zeus. The Romans equated their gods with those of the peoples they conquered. The idea that there could be only one god, that all other deities were false, that religious truth was exclusive rather than cumulative, this was revolutionary, even shocking. What led Amenhotep IV to this extraordinary conclusion? The historical sources are maddeningly silent on the question of his inner experience. We have no autobiography, no personal revelation narrative, no moment-by-moment account of how his thought evolved. What we have instead are the boundary stelae he would later erect around his new capital, inscriptions carved into living rock that proclaim his devotion to the Aten. We have hymns attributed to him that express theological ideas of stunning sophistication. We have the archaeological remains of the temples he built and the cities he founded. From these fragments, we must reconstruct the revolution that occurred in his mind. The key insight seems to have been about visibility and truth. The traditional gods of Egypt dwelt in darkness. Their statues resided in the innermost sanctuaries of temples, in rooms so sacred that only the pharaoh and the highest priest could enter. The gods were hidden, mysterious, approachable only through intermediaries and elaborate ritual. Their true forms were unknowable. They might appear to humans in dreams or visions, might manifest themselves in sacred animals, but their essential nature remained veiled in shadow and secrecy. The Aten was the opposite of this. The sun disk was visible to all every single day. It required no priest to interpret it, no darkened sanctuaries to house it, no complex theological explanations to understand it. It rose in the east every morning, crossed the sky, and set in the west every evening, as it had since the beginning of time. Its light fell on everyone, rich and poor, Egyptian and foreigner, human and animal alike. It was universal, immediate and undeniable. Moreover, the Aten was clearly the source of life. When it rose, the world awakened. Plants grew toward its light. Without it, there would be no warmth, no growth, no life of any kind. The connection between the sun and life was not a matter of theological speculation or priestly doctrine. It was simple, observable fact. In a sense, worshipping the Aten was the most rational form of religion imaginable, based on direct experience rather than inherited tradition. But Amenhotep IV's understanding of the Aten went deeper than simple sun worship. The Aten was not just a physical object, but the creative power that brought everything into existence and sustained it moment by moment. The sun disk, it was visible, but what it represented was transcendent. The divine power itself, the source of all being, infinite and eternal. In the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV made his break with tradition official. He ordered the construction of new temples to the Aten at Karnak, right in the heart of Amun's sacred precincts. These temples were unlike anything Egypt had seen before. Traditional Egyptian temples were designed as symbolic universes, growing progressively darker as one moved from the outer courts toward the inner sanctuary. creating a sense of mystery and sacred space set apart from the ordinary world. The Aten temples had no roofs. They were open to the sky, allowing sunlight to flood every corner, because the god they honoured was light itself, and light required no shadows. The decorative program of these temples was equally revolutionary. Instead of the formal, stylized art that had characterized Egyptian religious iconography for millennia, the new relief showed a startling realism and intimacy. The king and queen were depicted in casual poses, playing with their children, eating meals, engaging in everyday activities. The Aten itself was shown as a sun disk with rays extending downward, each ray ending in a small hand that offered the Ankh symbol, the hieroglyph for life, to the royal couple below. This new artistic style shocked Egyptian sensibilities. The traditional way of depicting pharaohs emphasized their divine nature, their separation from ordinary humanity. They were shown as eternally young, physically perfect, engaged only in ritual activities or military victories. But Amenhotep IV insisted on being shown as he actually appeared, with his unusual physical features, in informal moments as a husband and father as well as a king. It was as if he was saying that the old ways of representing divine kingship were as false as the old gods themselves. That truth required honest vision. Sometime around the middle of his 5th year as pharaoh, Amenhotep IV took a step that made his theological revolution unmistakable. He changed his name. No longer would he be called Amenhotep, which means Amun is satisfied. Instead, he would be known as Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, or devoted to the Aten. It was not merely a personal choice, but a public declaration, a repudiation of the god who had been supreme in Egypt for centuries. With the new name came new titles for the Aten itself. The god was given a cartouche, the oval frame usually reserved for royal names, emphasizing its status as a kind of divine pharaoh. The full titulary was complex. Ra-Horachti, who rejoices in the horizon, in his name of light, which is in the sun, disk. This was not the simple identification of the sun with a god named Ra or Horachti, but something more subtle, the recognition that the divine power manifested in the visible sun while remaining something more than merely physical. The priests of Amun watched these developments with growing alarm. They had served the hidden god for generations, had grown wealthy and powerful in his service, had shaped the religious and political life of Egypt according to their interpretations of his will. Now a young pharaoh, barely into his 20s, was declaring that their god did not exist, that their rituals were meaningless, that their entire way of understanding the cosmos was wrong. At first, they may have thought this was a phase, a young man's rebellion that would pass with maturity. Pharaohs had shown preference for particular deities before. Amenhotep IV's own father had been especially devoted to the goddess Mut and to the sun god in various forms. But this was different. This was not preference but exclusivity, not elevation but elimination. The implications were staggering. If Amun did not exist, what happened to the souls of all those who had died trusting in Osiris to resurrect them? What of the elaborate Book of the Dead rituals, the carefully prepared tomb chambers, the spells and prayers meant to ensure safe passage through the underworld? What of Maat itself, the cosmic order that the gods upheld? Akhenaten seems to have believed he had an answer to these questions, though we can only partially reconstruct his theology from surviving fragments. The Aten was the sole source of all life, visible and invisible. It created everything, sustained everything, and to it everything would return. There was no need for the complex mythology of death and resurrection, no need for journeys through the underworld, no need for magical spells and protective amulets. The Aten's light was eternal, and those who lived in truth in Ma'at, properly understood as alignment with the Aten's will, would somehow partake of that eternity. It was a simpler vision than the ancient religion, but it was also harsher in some ways. The old religion offered elaborate mechanisms for ensuring a favourable afterlife: rituals, bells, prayers, offerings. It promised that even those who had done wrong could be purified and redeemed. Akhenaten's theology seemed to offer no such guarantees, no intermediaries, no way to bargain with the divine. You lived in the light or you did not. The Aten gave life freely to all, but it did not promise any particular individual treatment. It was impersonal in its universality, indifferent in its beneficence. For the first time in Egypt's long history, the nation's god had no face, no mythology, no personality. The Aten did not have adventures, did not fight enemies, did not fall in love or feel jealousy. It simply was eternal, unchanging, perfect in its simplicity. And this hour, Akhenaten proclaimed, this God alone was real. The theological revolution that Akhenaten initiated was not merely abstract doctrine, but had immediate and concrete consequences for Egyptian society. As the king's devotion to the Aten deepened, and his rejection of the traditional gods became more explicit, the transformation began to affect every aspect of life in the two lands. The construction projects at Karnak demonstrated the new theology in stone and mud brick. Using a revolutionary building technique that employed thousands of small, easily handled blocks called talatat, rather than the massive stones of traditional construction, Akhenaten's workers erected temple after temple to the Aten with astonishing speed. These structures rose within sight of Amun's great complex, a deliberate challenge to the old order. The priests who had walked the sacred precincts of Karnak for generations now found their god's territory invaded by a rival faith, and that rival was promoted by the Pharaoh himself, the one individual whose word was law. The open-air design of the Aten temples represented more than architectural innovation. It embodied a completely different understanding of how the human encountered the divine. In the traditional temples, the experience of approaching the god was one of progressive revelation and mystery. One passed through great pylons, across courtyards where the common people might gather during festivals, into columned halls where the dimness increased, until finally reaching the sanctuary where the god statue resided in near total darkness. Only there, in that concentrated point of sacred space, could the divine presence be met. The Aten temples rejected this entire spatial theology. There were no shadowed sanctuaries, no progression from light to darkness, no secret holy of holies where God resided apart from humanity. Instead, the entire temple was open to the sky, and the God was present everywhere the sunlight fell. Worshippers stood in the open air beneath the sun, and the God they worshipped was immediately present, visible, undeniable. No priest could claim special access to this God because everyone had the same access. The Aten's light fell on all alike. This democratization of divine access threatened to undermine the entire structure of the Egyptian priesthood. The priest's power derived largely from their role as mediators between gods and humans. They knew the proper rituals, the correct prayers, the secret names by which the gods could be compelled or persuaded. They could interpret omens, divine the will of the gods, perform the magic that kept chaos at bay. But if the god was visible to all, if the proper form of worship was simply standing in sunlight and acknowledging the source of life, what did anyone need priests for? The reliefs that decorated the Aten temples drove this point home. They showed Akhenaten and Nefertiti offering to the Aten, receiving the Ankh symbols of life directly from the sun disk as rays. No other priests appeared in these scenes, no intermediaries, no elaborate ritual machinery. The royal couple stood alone beneath their god, and the message was clear. This was a religion of direct experience, of unmediated encounter with the divine. But Akhenaten's realization about the nature of truth and divinity led him to conclusions even more radical than theological reform. If the Aten alone was real, then all the other gods were false. And if they were false, then everything associated with them, their temples, their rituals, their images, represented not merely error, but a kind of cosmic pollution, a contamination of truth that needed to be purged. The early signs of this purge were subtle. References to other gods began to disappear from new inscriptions. The plural word for gods ceased to be used in official documents. When traditional religious phrases had to be employed for diplomatic or ceremonial purposes, careful scribes found ways to reinterpret them or avoid direct reference to the old deities. The king himself stopped participating in the traditional festivals that had structured the Egyptian year for millennia. This withdrawal from traditional religious practice created a growing unease. For ordinary Egyptians, the gods were not abstract theological concepts, but his intimate parts of daily life. They prayed to Hathor for success in love, to Thoth for success in learning, to Bes for protection in childbirth, to Taweret to guard their children, to their local deities for everything from good crops to cures for illness. The gods were woven into the fabric of existence, present in amulets and household shrines, invoked at every significant moment from birth to death. What did it mean to be told that these gods, the companions of a lifetime, the protectors one had always known, did not exist? The psychological impact must have been profound. It would be as if someone told you today that not only was your religion false, but that the natural world you thought you understood operated according to completely different principles than you had always believed. The foundation of meaning itself was being called into question. The priests of Amun, watching their influence erode and their god insulted, began to resist. We have no detailed records of this resistance. Akhenaten's eventual successors destroyed most documents from his reign, but we can infer it from later events. There must have been arguments at court, religious debates, attempts to persuade the king that he was making a terrible mistake. The priests controlled vast resources and could make things difficult even for a pharaoh. They had the loyalty of many in the bureaucracy, the support of tradition-minded nobles, the affection of a populace that had worshipped at Amun's altars for generations. But Akhenaten would not be moved. Perhaps he saw the priests' resistance as proof that they served not truth but their own power. Perhaps he believed that the corruption of the old religion was so deep that nothing short of complete transformation would suffice. Or perhaps he had experienced something, some vision, some revelation, some encounter with what he perceived as ultimate truth that made compromise impossible. Around the 5th year of his reign, as his conflict with the Amun priesthood intensified, Akhenaten made a decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential of his life. He would leave Thebes entirely. He would found a new capital, a city that had never known the worship of false gods, a place where the Aten alone would be honoured, where he could build a society according to his vision of religious truth. He would create in the desert a city of light. The decision was announced with characteristic drama. Akhenaten himself conducted a survey of potential sites, travelling along the Nile until he found a location that met his requirements, a broad plain on the east bank of the river, bounded by cliffs on 3 sides, virgin territory that belonged to no god and no city. Here, on ground never before devoted to any deity, he would build Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten, a name that described both the physical location, where the sun rose between the cliffs each morning, and the theological purpose, a place where the divine light would touch earth. To mark the boundaries of his new capital, Akhenaten ordered the carving of massive boundary stelae into the living rock of the surrounding cliffs. 14 of these monuments were created, each one proclaiming the king's devotion to the Aten and his determination to create a place of pure worship. The inscriptions on these stelae are among our most important sources for understanding Akhenaten's theology and intentions. In one particularly revealing passage, the king states that he chose this site because it belonged to no god, no goddess, no ruler, no person. It was pure, unclaimed, free from the associations and corruptions of the past. Here he could start fresh, build properly from the beginning, create the world as it should be. The language is striking in its absolutism. I shall make Akhenaten for the Aten my father in this place. I shall not make Akhenaten for him south of it, north of it, west of it, or east of it. The new capital would be exactly here, in this place that the god, or the king's vision of the god, had chosen. Reading these boundary inscriptions today, one is struck by the mixture of visionary fervour and authoritarian certainty. Akhenaten truly believed he had discovered ultimate truth, and that truth demanded complete transformation of his society. He would build a new city, establish a new religion, create a new art, forge a new way of being human in relationship to the divine. It was a project of staggering ambition, and it required turning away from everything Egypt had been for 3,000 years. The preparations for the move began immediately. Architects drew plans for temples, palaces, administrative buildings, workshops, and houses. Surveyors laid out streets and property boundaries. Thousands of workers, scribes, artisans, labourers, administrators were recruited or conscripted for the massive construction project. Ships began transporting building materials, food supplies, furniture, and equipment to the new site. The machinery of imperial power was redirected toward manifesting one man's religious vision in mud, brick, and stone. Within Thebes, those who watched these preparations must have experienced a complex mixture of emotions. Some perhaps shared the king's enthusiasm, attracted by the promise of a purer, simpler faith and by the opportunities that a new capital would create. Others surely felt bewilderment and fear, unable to comprehend why their legitimate pharaoh was abandoning the ancient capital, turning away from Amun, the god who had made Egypt great. Still others may have seen opportunity in the chaos, calculating how they might benefit from the coming changes. For the priests of Amun, the king's departure must have seemed like both a crisis and a relief. On one hand, Akhenaten's move represented a devastating rejection of their authority and the god they served. On the other hand, it removed the source of heresy from Thebes, allowing the old worship to continue relatively unmolested in the traditional capital. Perhaps, they may have thought, the king would build his solar city in the desert, indulge his theological obsessions there, and leave the real Egypt to function as it always had. Perhaps this crisis would pass. They could not have been more wrong. The departure from Thebes was not an escape, but the prelude to a more comprehensive attack on the old order. In his new city, free from the constraints of tradition and the resistance of powerful priests, Akhenaten would pursue his vision to its logical conclusion, and that conclusion would shake Egypt to its foundations. The move to Akhenaten represented more than a change of capitals. It was an exodus, a symbolic breaking with the past as decisive as any in human history. The young pharaoh who rode his chariot out from Thebes toward his virgin capital was leaving behind not merely a city, but an entire world of meaning, an entire structure of understanding how humans related to the cosmos and to the divine. He was venturing into uncharted theological territory, guided by a vision of light that blinded him to the shadows his revolution would cast. The journey from Thebes to the site of the new capital covered approximately 200 miles of river travel, several days by boat with the current. We can imagine the flotilla that must have accompanied the royal family, barges laden with supplies, ships carrying courtiers and officials, vessels transporting the materials needed to establish a functioning capital in the wilderness. The move was not accomplished all at once, but in stages, over months, and perhaps years, as buildings were completed and made habitable, as the infrastructure necessary for sustaining a major population centre was put in place. The site Akhenaten had chosen was striking in its isolation and its geography. The broad plain, roughly 5 miles long and 2 miles wide, was embraced by a dramatic amphitheatre of cliffs that created a natural boundary, a world set apart. To the east, these cliffs rose 200 feet and more, their faces catching the first light of dawn. To the west, across the Nile, the desert stretched toward the distant plateau. To the north and south, the valley narrowed, creating the sense of a protected enclosure, a sacred precinct on a massive scale. The location had practical advantages. The plain offered ample space for construction, the river provided water and transportation. The surrounding desert supplied building materials, limestone from the cliffs, sand and clay for mud bricks, gypsum for plaster. But the site's selection was primarily symbolic. This was empty land, virgin territory where the Aten's city could rise without having to displace older sanctuaries, without inheriting the religious associations of previous occupation. It was a blank slate upon which Akhenaten could write his vision. The first structures erected were the boundary stelae, those massive monuments carved into the cliff faces that proclaim the new city's foundation and purpose. The process of creating these stelae was immensely labour-intensive. Workers had to climb the cliffs, smooth sections of the rock face, and then carve the detailed hieroglyphic inscriptions and relief images deep into the stone. Each stela included images of Akhenaten, Nefertiti and their daughters worshipping beneath the Aten's rays, along with lengthy texts describing the king's intentions and decrees. The content of these boundary inscriptions reveals much about Akhenaten's mindset during this crucial period. He was not merely building a new capital, but establishing what he saw as a permanent centre of true religion, a place that would endure forever as testimony to the Aten's glory. He swore solemn oaths that he would not extend the city's boundaries beyond the limits he had established, that neither he nor anyone else would persuade him to relocate elsewhere, that he would be buried in this place along with his family and the high officials of his court. These oaths had a defensive quality, as if Akhenaten anticipated attempts to turn him back from his course. They suggest he knew his decision to abandon Thebes and create a new capital devoted to the Aten would face opposition. By carving his intentions into imperishable stone and swearing by his father the Aten, he was trying to make his choice irrevocable, to commit himself so thoroughly that retreat would be impossible. The layout of Akhenaten reflected Akhenaten's religious vision, translated into urban planning. Unlike traditional Egyptian cities that had grown organically over centuries, accumulating temples and neighbourhoods in haphazard fashion, the new capital was designed as a coherent whole. A great royal road ran north-south through the city's centre, wide enough for processional chariots and ceremonies. Along this road were positioned the major public buildings, temples, palaces, administrative complexes. The heart of the city was the Great Aten Temple, an enormous structure covering approximately 800 by 300 metres. This temple followed the open-air design Akhenaten had pioneered at Karnak, but on a vastly larger scale. A person entering through the great pylon at the western end would walk down a long processional way, flanked by offering tables and altars, all exposed to the sky. At the eastern end of the complex stood the main sanctuary, the Pharaoh, or House of Rejoicing, where the king himself performed the principal rituals of offering to the Aten. The small Aten temple stood nearby, more intimate in scale but equally open to the sky. This may have been used for private worship by the royal family, or for ceremonies not requiring the vast spaces of the great temple. The architectural details of both temples emphasize light and openness. No columns obstructing sightlines, no roofs blocking the sun, no shadowed corners where the old gods might lurk. Adjacent to the temples was the Great Palace, a sprawling complex that served as the administrative heart of the empire, as well as the king's residence. The palace was connected by a bridge to what archaeologists call the king's house, creating a symbolic and literal link between the royal and sacred precincts. This bridge became famous in later archaeological excavations because it preserves spectacular examples of the painted pavement that once decorated elite structures at Amarna. Naturalistic images of fish, birds, and plants rendered with an attention to detail unprecedented in Egyptian art. The artistic revolution that Akhenaten had initiated with his Karnak temples reached its full flowering in Amarna. The new style, now called Amarna art, broke decisively with the rigid conventions that had governed Egyptian visual culture for millennia. Figures were shown in casual poses with realistic proportion, engaging in everyday activities. The king and queen were depicted kissing, embracing their children, sharing meals, scenes of domestic intimacy that would have been unthinkable in traditional royal iconography. This artistic transformation was not merely aesthetic but theological. The old art style, with its formal rigidity and symbolic rather than realistic portrayal of figures, had been intimately connected to the old religion. Those stylized images were meant to be eternal, to exist outside of time, to represent not individual people but timeless types. By insisting on realistic, time-bound, individualized portraiture, Akhenaten was making a statement about the nature of truth and divinity. The Aten was real, physical, present in the actual world. Therefore, art should show the real world, real people, real moments, not idealized abstractions. The most distinctive feature of Amarna art was the way it depicted the royal family's physical characteristics. Akhenaten was shown with his elongated skull, protruding belly, and unusual proportions. Nefertiti appeared with her long, graceful neck and sharply defined features. The daughters were rendered as miniature versions of their parents, with similar physical characteristics. Initially, scholars assumed these images must be caricatures or that Akhenaten suffered from some deforming disease, but more recent analysis suggests something more complex. The artistic style may have been deliberately exaggerated to make a theological point. In some ancient Egyptian thinking, the creator deity combined both male and female characteristics, being complete in itself and requiring no other. By showing himself with both traditionally masculine and feminine physical traits, Akhenaten may have been claiming a divine status that transcended ordinary human categories. He was not just the Aten's son, but its earthly manifestation, embodying the god's creative power in human form. Or the art may have been attempting something unprecedented in ancient representation, true portraiture that captured individual appearance rather than conforming to standard types. If Akhenaten genuinely had an unusual appearance, the new artistic style would have obligated artists to depict him as he actually looked, rather than according to the idealized conventions of the past. Either way, the art style was revolutionary, shocking to Egyptian sensibilities, and inseparable from the religious transformation Akhenaten was attempting. As the city took shape, its population grew. Estimates suggest Akhenaten may have housed 20,000 to 50,000 people at its height, making it one of the major urban centres of Egypt. The residents included not only court officials and priests of the Aten, but also the workers, artisans and servants necessary to support them. Archaeological excavations have revealed neighbourhoods of different status, mansions for high officials with painted walls and elaborate gardens, workshops for sculptors and other craftsmen, and more modest housing for workers. The city had its own rhythm distinct from traditional Egyptian urban life. The day began with the sunrise, when Akhenaten would emerge to perform the morning ritual at the Great Temple, greeting the Aten as it appeared over the eastern cliffs. The hymns sung during these ceremonies broke with traditional religious formulae, using language that was closer to spoken Egyptian than to the archaic formal expressions of the old liturgies. The king composed or inspired new prayers that emphasized the Aten's role as creator and sustainer of all life, that described the sun's daily journey in terms that were both poetic and naturalistic. Life in Akhenaten must have had a quality of unreality for those who had known the old Egypt. Here was a major city that had no temples to Amun, Osiris, or any of the traditional deities. No festivals honoured the old gods. No processions carried their images through the streets. The religious calendar was simplified to focus entirely on solar events, daily worship at sunrise, midday and sunset, special celebrations at solstices and equinoxes. The elaborate cycle of festivals that had structured life in Thebes and other traditional cities was abandoned, replaced by a stark focus on the sun's daily journey. For those who embraced Akhenaten's vision, this simplification may have seemed liberating. No longer did one need to navigate complex relationships with dozens of deities, remember countless ritual requirements, seek the favour of this god for one purpose and that goddess for another. There was only the Aten, only light, only the simple act of acknowledging the source of life. Faith became a matter of direct experience rather than inherited tradition. But for others, the new religion must have seemed frighteningly empty. Where were the stories that had given meaning to life's passages? Where was Osiris to greet the dead and promise resurrection? Where was Isis to protect mothers and children? Where were the local deities that had been companions since childhood, the gods one's parents and grandparents had worshipped? All of that rich mythological texture, those countless stories and associations that had made the world meaningful, was simply erased, replaced by an austere theology of pure light. The construction of Akhenaten proceeded with remarkable speed. Using the Talatat block construction method and employing thousands of workers, the major structures were completed within just a few years. By the 8th year of his reign, Akhenaten was able to move his court permanently to the new capital. The king who had left Thebes as Amenhotep IV arrived at Akhenaten fully transformed into Akhenaten, devoted servant of the Aten, determined to reshape Egyptian civilization according to his singular vision. As the court settled into its new home, as the temples began their daily round of solar worship, as the city found its rhythm, there must have been a sense among true believers that they were participating in something unprecedented, that history itself was being remade. They had left the old world behind and entered into a new one, governed by new principles, oriented toward a new understanding of the divine. The desert around them was empty, but they would fill it with light. The cliffs enclosed them, but within that enclosure they were building paradise. What they could not see in their enthusiasm and certainty were the shadows gathering at the edges of their city of light, the consequences that would flow from their revolution, the suffering that would result from imposing one man's vision of truth upon an entire civilization. In Thebes, the priests of Amun waited and remembered. In the provinces, administrators struggled to understand what was being asked of them. Along the borders of the empire, foreign rulers sent letters pleading for attention, for military support, for some sign that the pharaoh still cared about the empire his ancestors had built. But in Akhenaten, beneath the brilliant sun, Akhenaten heard only one voice, saw only one truth, and that truth was light itself. The full establishment of Akhenaten as Egypt's capital represented one of the most ambitious urban planning projects of the ancient world. What had been barren desert just years before was now a functioning metropolis, complete with temples, palaces, administrative buildings, workshops, residential neighborhoods, and all the infrastructure necessary to support a major population center and serve as the nerve center of an empire. The Great Aten Temple, the Aten, dominated the city's sacred landscape. His vast open courts, unlike anything in traditional Egyptian temple architecture, created a unique spatial experience. A worshipper entering the complex would pass through a series of pylons and courtyards, but instead of progressing into increasing darkness as in a traditional temple, they moved through immense spaces equally flooded with light. Hundreds of offering tables lined the processional way, each one piled with bread, beer, meat, vegetables, flowers, the abundance of Egypt laid out before the sun disk. The sheer scale of offerings at the Great Temple was staggering. Calculations based on surviving inscriptions suggest that daily offerings to the Aten included thousands of loaves of bread, hundreds of jars of beer, cattle, geese, and quantities of other foods that would have required dedicated agricultural estates and extensive logistical organization. Some scholars have argued that the offering system at Amarna actually exceeded that of Amun's temples at their height, that Akhenaten simply redirected Egypt's religious resources from the old god to the new rather than reducing the apparatus of worship. The smaller Aten temple, located near the Great Temple, seems to have served a more intimate function. Its courts, though still roofless, were smaller and more enclosed, perhaps allowing for private worship by the royal family. Reliefs from this temple show Akhenaten and Nefertiti bringing offerings together, their daughters accompanying them, the whole family united in devotion to the Aten. This emphasis on family worship was another distinctive feature of the new religion. In traditional Egyptian religion, royal women might hold significant religious offices and participate in important rituals, but the artistic program of Amarna elevated Nefertiti to an unprecedented level of prominence and included the royal daughters in worship scenes that would traditionally have featured only the king. Nefertiti's role at Amarna went beyond ceremonial. She appears in reliefs performing rituals that were traditionally reserved for the pharaoh, smiting Egypt's enemies and making offerings to the god. Some inscriptions give her names and titles that parallel those of Akhenaten, suggesting she may have been considered a co-ruler in religious if not political terms. The famous painted limestone bust of Nefertiti, discovered in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose in 1912, and now one of the most recognised artefacts from ancient Egypt, captures the regal bearing and distinctive features of this remarkable woman who shared Akhenaten's religious revolution. The royal residences at Amarna were as innovative as the temples. The Great Palace, which stretched for over 700 metres along the royal road, included enormous halls for state occasions, private apartments, gardens with pools, and extensive facilities for administration. The northern palace, located at the city's edge, may have served as a retreat, featuring elaborate gardens, pools stocked with fish, and aviaries for exotic birds. These palaces demonstrated that rejection of traditional religion did not mean rejection of royal luxury and comfort. The decoration of the palaces showcased the naturalistic style of Amarna art at its finest. Painted pavements showed marshland scenes with fish swimming among papyrus reeds, ducks taking flight, calves frolicking. Wall paintings depicted garden scenes, wildlife, and intimate family moments. Everything was rendered with an attention to natural detail, a celebration of the living world that the Aten had created. It was a theology of affirmation rather than denial, acknowledging the beauty and goodness of physical existence. The administrative quarter of the city housed the offices from which the empire was governed. Here, archaeologists have found the remains of the diplomatic archive, the Amarna letters, more than 300 clay tablets inscribed in Akkadian, the lingua franca of ancient Near Eastern diplomacy. These letters, sent by foreign rulers to the Egyptian court, provide invaluable insights into international relations during Akhenaten's reign, and reveal some of the strains his religious preoccupations placed on Egypt's foreign policy. The workshops of Amarna produced the art that gave visual form to Akhenaten's theological vision. Master sculptors like Thutmose oversaw workshops that created everything from colossal statuary for temple decoration to small private devotional objects. The workshop excavations have provided fascinating glimpses into the artistic process. Trial pieces showing different approaches to particular subjects, plaster casts taken from finished sculptures, unfinished works that reveal how the distinctive Amarna style was constructed. One of the most intriguing discoveries was a series of composite statues that could be assembled and disassembled, apparently allowing for experimentation with different poses and arrangements. This suggests a workshop culture focused on innovation and problem solving, appropriate for artists who are being asked to create in ways that broke with thousands of years of tradition. These craftsmen were not merely following established patterns, but inventing a new visual language to express new theological ideas. The residential neighbourhoods of Amarna followed a clear social hierarchy. High officials built substantial estates with dozens of rooms, courtyards, gardens, chapels for worship, and quarters for servants. The houses of these elite followed a standard plan. A reception area near the entrance, living quarters in the centre, service areas at the back, but allowed for individual variation and decoration according to taste and means. Even in private homes, the religious transformation was evident. Houses at Amarna typically included a small chapel or shrine, but unlike similar spaces in traditional Egyptian homes, these were not dedicated to household gods like Bes or Taweret, or to ancestors. Instead, they contained stelae, showing the royal family worshipping the Aten, and it was through the intermediary of the royal couple that ordinary people accessed the god. This was a crucial aspect of Atenist theology. While the sun shone on everyone, proper worship apparently required connection through the king and queen, who alone had direct access to the deity. This theological structure preserved royal authority, even while simplifying the religious system. In the old religion, anyone could approach any god directly through offerings and prayers. Local priests could perform rituals, magicians could invoke divine powers, and individuals had numerous channels for accessing the sacred. In Atenism, those channels were narrowed to essentially one: the royal family as intermediaries between humanity and the Aten. This meant that religious authority was even more concentrated in the pharaoh than before, despite the religion's apparent simplification. The working-class neighbourhoods of Amarna excavated most extensively in what archaeologists call the workman's village, show a different face of life in the City of Light. Here, in tightly packed houses that shared walls, lived the labourers who quarried stone, hauled materials, baked bricks, and performed the countless manual tasks required to build and maintain the capital. Their lives were harder than those of the elite, their houses smaller and less comfortable, their diets plainer. Archaeological evidence from these working-class areas reveals that, despite the official religious policy, traditional beliefs persisted. Amulets of traditional deities have been found, suggesting that while the elite might embrace Atenism fully, ordinary people hedged their spiritual bets. They might attend official festivals and acknowledge the Aten publicly, but in their homes they still turned to Bes to protect their children, still prayed to Taweret during childbirth, still trusted in the old gods who had served their families for generations. This gap between official ideology and popular practice is a recurring feature of religious revolutions. Those at the top, committed to the new vision, may genuinely transform their beliefs and practices. Those lower down, preoccupied with survival and uncertain about abstruse theological questions, often maintain older patterns, even while giving outward conformity to the new order. Akhenaten could build temples to the Aten and forbid worship of other gods, but he could not ultimately control what people believed in their hearts or did in the privacy of their homes. The city's infrastructure was impressive for its time. A main well-provided water, supplemented by the Nile for most purposes. Streets were laid out in a relatively regular grid in the planned sections, though they became less organised in areas that grew more organically. There was a police station, identified by batons found there, suggesting concern with maintaining order. Grain silos stored food supplies. Administrative buildings oversaw taxation and resource distribution. Yet for all its sophistication, Akhenaten faced challenges inherent in its location and rushed construction. The site was hot and arid, lacking the lush vegetation that surrounded more established cities along the Nile. The quick construction meant that buildings were not always solidly built. Archaeologists have found evidence of settling, cracking, and other structural problems. The city's isolation, while symbolically important for Akhenaten's vision, made it dependent on supply lines that could be disrupted. More fundamentally, Akhenaten lacked the accumulated cultural capital of traditional cities. Thebes had been built up over centuries, its temples enriched by countless generations of royal donations, its workshops perfecting their crafts over lifetimes, its neighbourhoods developing distinctive characters and traditions. Memphis had been Egypt's capital for much of its history, with institutions and practices refined over millennia. Akhenaten was built in years, attempting to replace overnight what had developed over ages. The cultural life of the new capital reflected its creator's obsessions. There were no festivals for Osiris, no procession for Amun, no celebrations of the countless local deities that had given rhythm to the Egyptian year. Instead, life revolved around the sun's daily journey. Morning rituals greeted the dawn. Midday ceremonies acknowledged the sun at its height. Evening services marked the sunset. The simplicity must have seemed stark to those who remembered the rich tapestry of the old religious calendar. Music and poetry flourished at Amarna, but it was music and poetry in service of the new theology. Hymns to the Aten were composed, some of them probably by Akhenaten himself, expressing the religious vision that motivated the entire enterprise. These hymns represented the literary high point of Atenism, texts of genuine beauty and philosophical sophistication that expressed a coherent, if revolutionary understanding of divinity and creation. The most famous of these hymns, preserved in the tomb of Akhenaten's close advisor and eventual successor, is worth examining in detail, for it represents the fullest expression we have of Atenist theology, the most complete articulation of what Akhenaten believed he had discovered in the desert sun. The great hymn to the Aten stands as one of the most remarkable religious texts to survive from the ancient world. Carved in hieroglyphs on the wall of the tomb of at Amarna, this hymn is generally attributed to Akhenaten himself, though whether the king composed it personally or commissioned it from court poets remains uncertain. What is certain is that the text represents the mature expression of Atenist theology, the fullest articulation of the religious vision that motivated Akhenaten's revolution. The hymn begins with an invocation of the Aten at sunrise. You appear beautifully on the horizon of heaven, O living Aten, the beginning of life. When you rise on the eastern horizon, you fill every land with your beauty. You are gracious, great, glistening, and high over every land. Your rays encompass the lands to the limit of all that you have made. As you are Ra, you reach to the end of them. You subdue them for your beloved Son. Though you are far away, your rays are on earth. Though you are in their faces, no one knows you're going. The opening establishes several key themes that run throughout the hymn. The Aten is associated with beauty, with light, with the beginning and sustaining of life. It encompasses all lands, not just Egypt, a universalism unprecedented in Egyptian religious literature. The sun is both near and far, visible yet mysterious. Its light is accessible to all, yet its essential nature remains unknowable. The hymn then describes the darkness of night and the awakening of the world at dawn. When you set in the western horizon, the land is in darkness, in the manner of death. They sleep in a room with heads wrapped up, nor sees one eye the other. All their goods which are under their heads might be stolen, but they would not perceive it. Every lion is come forth from his den, all creeping things bite. Darkness is the shroud, and the earth is in stillness. For he who made them rests in his horizon. At daybreak when you arise on the horizon, when you shine as the Aten by day, you drive away the darkness and give your rays. The two lands are in festivity every day, awake and standing upon their feet, for you have raised them up. Washing their bodies, taking their clothing, their arms are raised in praise at your appearance. All the world they do their work. This passage captures the fundamental experience that seems to have sparked Akhenaten's religious insight, the absolute dependence of life on the sun. When it suns, the world descends into darkness and danger. When it rises, life resumes. People awaken, work can be done. The connection between sun and life is not mystical abstraction, but observable fact, the most basic reality of existence. The hymn continues with a detailed catalogue of the Aten's creative and sustaining activity. All beasts are content with their pasturage, trees and plants are flourishing. The birds which fly from their nests, their wings are stretched out in praise to your ka. All beasts spring upon their feet. Whatever flies and alights, they live when you have risen for them. The ships are sailing north and south as well, for every way is open at your appearance. The fish in the river dart before your face. Your rays are in the midst of the great green sea. The naturalism here is striking. This is not mythology, but observation. Accurate description of how the world actually works, how animals behave, how human activity follows the sun's rhythm, how even fish seem to respond to light. The God being praised is not hidden away in some transcendent realm, but manifest in the everyday functioning of the natural world. The hymn then addresses the Aten's role as creator. Creator of seed in women, you who make fluid into man, who maintains the son in the womb of his mother, who soothes him with that which stills his weeping, you nurse even in the womb, who gives breath to sustain all that he has made. When he descends from the womb to breathe on the day when he is born, you open his mouth completely. You supply his necessities. When the chick in the egg speaks within the shell, you give him breath within it to maintain him. When you have made him his fulfillment within the egg, to break it, he comes forth from the egg to speak at his fulfillment, and he walks upon his legs when he comes forth from it. This passage extends the Aten's creative power into the intimate processes of generation and birth. The god's rays penetrate everywhere, even into the womb, even into the egg. Every breath, every moment of life comes from the same source, the sun's life-giving power. The theology here is simultaneously cosmic and intimate, describing a God that sustains the universe yet attends to each individual sparrow. The hymn's universalism becomes explicit in its description of human diversity. How manifold it is, what you have made. They are hidden from the face of man, O sole God, like whom there is no other. You did create the world according to your desire, whilst you were alone. All men, cattle, and wild beasts, whatever is on earth, going upon its feet, and what is on high, flying with its wings. The countries of Syria, Nubia, the land of Egypt, you set every man in his place, you supply their necessities. Everyone has his food, and his time of life is reckoned. Their tongues are separate in speech, and their natures as well. Their skins are distinguished, as you distinguish the foreign peoples. This is revolutionary theology for the ancient Near East. The Aten is not the god of Egypt against other nations' gods, but the god of all peoples, who created their diversity deliberately, who provides for all equally. The different languages, appearances, and customs of various peoples are not corruption or falling away from some original unity, but intentional divine creation. The universalism here anticipates later monotheistic traditions, while remaining rooted in the solar theology specific to Atenism. The hymn returns to the theme of water in the Nile, that most crucial element of Egyptian life. You make a Nile in the underworld. You bring it forth as you desire to maintain the people of Egypt according as you made them for yourself, the Lord of all of them, wearing himself with them, the Lord of every land, rising for them, the Aten of the day, great of majesty. All distant foreign countries you make their life also, for you have set a Nile in heaven, that it may descend for them and make waves upon the mountains like the great green sea, to water their fields in their towns. This passage addresses what must have been a theological puzzle for solar monotheism. If the sun is the source of all life, how does one explain the Nile, Egypt's other essential life source, which seems independent of the sun's daily journey? The hymn's answer is that the Aten creates the Nile as it creates everything else, and even provides analogous water sources, rain, for foreign lands that lack Egypt's great river. The vision encompasses all of human existence, Egyptian and foreign, unified under the single creative power of the sun disk. The hymn concludes with an assertion of the exclusive relationship between the Aten and Akhenaten. There is no other that knows you except your son Akhenaten. You have made him wise in your designs and in your might. The world came into being by your hand, according as you have made them. When you have risen they live, when you set they die. Your lifetime your own self, for one lives only through you. Eyes are fixed on beauty until you set. All work is laid aside when you set in the west, but when you rise again, everything is made to flourish for the king. Since you did found the earth and raise them up for your son, who came forth from your body, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, who lives on truth, the lord of the two lands, Akhenaten, and the chief wife of the king, Nefertiti, living and youthful forever and ever. This ending is significant for what it reveals about Atenist theology's political dimension. The Aten may be universal, may create and sustain all peoples, but true knowledge of the god belongs exclusively to Akhenaten. The king is not merely a worshipper among others, but the unique mediator, the one who truly understands the divine nature and will. Through him and through Nefertiti, whose inclusion here is notable, humanity accesses the Aten. The solar disk may shine on all, but its meaning as proper worship comes through the royal couple alone. The literary quality of the great hymn is remarkable. It combines detailed natural observation with philosophical reflection, personal devotion with the cosmic vision. The language is relatively simple and direct compared to the archaic, formulaic style of traditional Egyptian religious texts. It speaks in a voice that feels authentic, as if expressing genuine religious experience rather than repeating inherited formulae. Scholars have long noted similarities between the great hymn to the Aten and Psalm 104 in the Hebrew Bible. Both texts praise a creator God who brings forth life, who sustains all creatures, who makes the sun and uses water to nourish the earth. The parallels are close enough that they have sparked theories about cultural transmission. Could the Hebrew psalm have been influenced by Akhenaten's hymn, Could there be some historical connection between Atenism and early Hebrew monotheism? The evidence for direct influence is thin. Several centuries separate Akhenaten from the probable composition date of Psalm 104. The mechanisms by which an Egyptian royal hymn might have been transmitted to Hebrew psalmists remain speculative. It is more likely that both texts draw on common ancient Near Eastern literary traditions of nature hymns and creation theology, adapting these traditions to their respective monotheistic frameworks. Still, the parallels are intriguing and suggest that Akhenaten's theological innovations, even if they failed in Egypt, may have resonated more broadly in the cultural matrix of the ancient Near East. What the hymn reveals most clearly is the nature of Akhenaten's religious vision. This was not a primitive sun worship, not a simple identification of God with a physical object. Rather, it was a sophisticated theology that used the visible sun as a symbol and manifestation of transcendent creative power. The Aten was simultaneously physical and metaphysical, knowable through direct observation yet mysterious in its ultimate nature, universal in its scope yet intimately involved with every individual life. The hymn also reveals the revolution's fundamental paradox. On one hand, it democratizes access to the divine. The Aten is visible to all, its benefits extend to all peoples equally, its worship requires no complex rituals or priestly intermediaries. On the other hand, it concentrates religious authority absolutely in the Pharaoh, who alone truly knows the God, who alone can properly interpret its will. The simplification of theology coincided with an intensification of royal power. This paradox would become increasingly important as Akhenaten's reign progressed. For while the hymn expresses a beautiful, coherent vision of universal divine creativity, translating that vision into social and political reality proved far more problematic. A theology of light sounds benign, even enlightened, but imposing that theology on a society shaped by different beliefs, forcibly eliminating the religious practices that had sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia, this was neither benign nor enlightened. It was authoritarian, traumatic, and ultimately unsustainable. As the hymn was being carved into A's tomb wall, as its phrases were being sung in the daily rituals at Amarna's temples, the real consequences of Akhenaten's revolution were becoming increasingly apparent. The beautiful theology and the harsh reality were beginning to diverge, and that divergence would prove catastrophic. As Akhenaten's reign progressed beyond its first decade, and Akhenaten became firmly established as Egypt's capital, the king's religious policies grew increasingly radical. What had begun as a preference for the Aten over other gods evolved into explicit rejection of all traditional deities. The phase of building new temples was giving way to a phase of destruction and erasure, as Akhenaten attempted to purge Egypt of what he now saw as false worship. The most dramatic manifestation of this intensified campaign was the closure of temples throughout Egypt. Royal decrees ordered that the sanctuaries of Amun and other traditional gods be shut. Their rituals ceased, their priesthoods disbanded. This was unprecedented in Egyptian history. Pharaohs had sometimes shown preference for particular deities, had built new temples and endowed them lavishly, but they had never before attempted to suppress the traditional gods entirely. The economic implications were staggering. The temples of Egypt were not merely religious institutions but economic powerhouses. They owned vast agricultural estates, employed thousands of workers, controlled substantial portions of Egypt's wealth. The Temple of Amun at Karnak alone possessed hundreds of thousands of acres of land, flocks of cattle numbering in the hundreds of thousands, workshops producing everything from textiles to jewellery, boats, granaries, and treasure houses filled with gold. To close these temples was to disrupt a major segment of the Egyptian economy. Workers who had made their living in the service of the traditional gods suddenly found themselves unemployed. Priests who had inherited their positions through family lines stretching back generations lost their livelihoods and their social status. The complex web of obligations, gifts, and economic exchanges that had been built around temple festivals and offerings was disrupted. In a traditional society where economic roles were largely hereditary and socially determined, This kind of upheaval created genuine hardship. But the economic disruption, severe as it was, paled beside the psychological and spiritual trauma. For ordinary Egyptians, the closure of temples meant being cut off from the gods who had been the companions of their lives. Where did one go now with prayers for a sick child? Who would protect travellers on dangerous journeys? What rituals would ensure proper treatment in the afterlife? The entire framework of meaning that had organised Egyptian existence for millennia was being declared null and void. Akhenaten's enforcers went further than merely closing temples. Teams of workers were dispatched throughout Egypt to chisel away references to the prescribed gods from monuments and inscriptions. The name of Amun was a particular target. Wherever it appeared, it was to be erased. Since Amun's name was a component of many personal names, place names, and royal titles, this meant defacing countless inscriptions from monumental temple walls to small personal objects. The vandalism was systematic and thorough. Workers climbed scaffolds to reach inscriptions high on temple pylons. They entered tombs to erase divine names from funeral texts. They modified statuary, removing or reworking images that referenced the old gods. The effort required must have been enormous, involving large teams of workers over extended periods. Yet Akhenaten insisted on it, apparently believing that the written word had power, that allowing the names of false gods to remain carved in stone was a kind of pollution that must be cleansed. This iconoclastic campaign created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Officials and scribes had to be constantly vigilant, ensuring that their own inscriptions and monuments did not contain prescribed references that might bring royal disfavour. A scribe copying a traditional text had to make split-second decisions about whether to include or exclude particular phrases and names. The uncertainty about what was acceptable and what was forbidden must have been paralysing for many. In the provinces, far from Akhenaten's direct supervision, the situation was particularly complex. Local administrators received contradictory pressures. On one hand, elder decrees demanded that they suppress traditional worship and promote Atenism. On the other hand, the populations they governed remained attached to their local gods and the temples that had been centres of community life for generations. A governor who enforced Akhenaten's edicts too zealously risked provoking resistance or even revolt. One who ignored them risked royal displeasure. The surviving evidence suggests that compliance with Akhenaten's religious policies varied considerably by location and by the enthusiasm of local officials. Some administrators seem to have embraced the new religion genuinely, or at least found it politically expedient to show zealous support. Others gave nominal compliance while quietly allowing traditional practices to continue. Still others may have actively resisted, though such resistance left few traces in the archaeological record since Akhenaten's eventual successors had every reason to destroy evidence of the preceding reign. The disruption extended to the most fundamental aspects of Egyptian religion, the treatment of the dead. For millennia, Egyptians had prepared for the afterlife through mummification, provision of funerary goods, and ritual practices designed to ensure resurrection and eternal life. These practices were deeply intertwined with the mythology of Osiris, the god of the dead who had himself died and been resurrected. They involved invoking numerous protective deities, inscribing spells and prayers that referenced the traditional gods, and following protocols that had been refined over countless generations. But if the traditional gods did not exist, what happened to these funerary practices? The evidence from Amarna is confusing and contradictory. Some tombs prepared for Akhenaten's officials show adaptations of traditional funerary motifs to Atenist theology, prayers addressed to the Aten rather than Osiris, scenes of the royal family as intermediaries with the divine rather than traditional gods. But other elements of traditional practice seem to have continued, perhaps because no one had worked out satisfactory Atenist alternatives, or perhaps because fear of death and uncertainty about the afterlife overwhelmed ideological purity. The royal tombs at Amarna, carved into the cliffs east of the city, show Akhenaten attempting to create a new funerary tradition. These tombs were designed to catch the rising sun, to allow the Aten's rays to penetrate into the burial chambers. The decoration emphasized the royal family's devotion to the Atens rather than traditional funerary scenes. But even here, practical necessities intervened. Mummification continued because no one had developed an alternative way to preserve bodies. Grave goods were provided, though because custom demanded it. The old practices had roots too deep to be entirely torn out, even by a pharaoh determined to transform Egyptian religion completely. As temples closed and traditional practices were suppressed, an interesting phenomenon occurred. Private, unofficial worship of the old gods seems to have intensified. Archaeological evidence from working-class areas at Amarna and from sites throughout Egypt shows continued use of amulets depicting traditional deities, household shrines that maintained old practices, and other forms of what we might call religious resistance. People deprived of official channels for accessing their gods simply created unofficial ones. This popular resistance to Akhenaten's religious revolution is significant because it suggests the limits of royal power in ancient Egypt. The pharaoh could close temples, disband priesthoods, and erase divine names from public monuments. But he could not control what people did in their homes, what they believed in, their hearts, which small amulets they carried for protection. The old gods, driven from their temples and official worship, took refuge in the everyday lives of ordinary Egyptians who refused to abandon them. For Akhenaten, this popular attachment to traditional religion must have been frustrating and perhaps incomprehensible. From his perspective, he had discovered truth, had direct access to the real God, had created a pure rational theology based on observable natural phenomena. Why could his people not see what he saw? Why did they cling to shadows and illusions? The answer, which he seems never to have grasped, was that religion is not primarily about abstract theological truth, but about meaning, comfort, and connection, things the old gods had provided for generations, and that the Aten, for all its universality and light, somehow failed to supply for most Egyptians. The silence that fell over Egypt's temples in this period was not peaceful but ominous. It was the silence of forced closure, of interrupted ritual, of communal practices made impossible. In Thebes, the great festival processions no longer wound through the streets. In Memphis, the sacred Apis bull no longer received worshippers. In countless village shrines, offerings ceased. The gods, if they existed, had been driven into hiding by a pharaoh who claimed they had never been real at all. And in that silence, something essential was breaking. The old covenant between gods, pharaoh, and people, the understanding that had sustained Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years, was being violated. Ma'at, the cosmic order, was being disrupted not by chaos from outside but by Egypt's own king. The consequences of that disruption would soon become catastrophically apparent. At the centre of Akhenaten's revolution stood not a solitary figure but a partnership. The king and his great royal wife Nefertiti. Unlike most royal women in Egyptian history who remain shadowy figures known mainly through titles and occasional representations, Nefertiti emerges from the historical record with unusual clarity and prominence. Her role in the Aten religion was not merely supportive but active, simple, and possibly co-equal with that of the king himself. The name Nefertiti means the beautiful one has come, and indeed her iconic beauty has captivated the modern world since the discovery in 2012 of the painted limestone bust now in Berlin's Neues Museum. That sculpture, with its graceful neck, refined features, and enigmatic expression, has made Nefertiti's face one of the most recognizable from the ancient world. But the historical Nefertiti was far more than a beautiful figure. She was a queen of exceptional power and influence, a key figure in the religious transformation of Egypt. We know frustratingly little about Nefertiti's origins. Unlike many royal wives, whose family connections are carefully documented, Nefertiti's parentage remains uncertain. Some evidence suggests she may have been the daughter of the influential courtier who would eventually become pharaoh after Tutankhamun's death. Others have speculated that she might have been a foreign princess, perhaps from Mitanni, though this theory has less support. What is clear is that by the early years of Amenhotep IV's reign, She was his chief wife and a prominent figure at her court. In the art of Amarna, Nefertiti appears with a frequency and in contexts that have no parallel in earlier Egyptian history. She is shown not merely as a royal consort but as an active participant in religious ritual. The walls of Amarna temples depict her making offerings to the Aten, driving a chariot, even smiting Egypt's enemies, an action traditionally shown only for the pharaoh. In some representations, her image is the same size as Akhenaten's, suggesting parity rather than subordination. The Aten's rays extend to both of them equally, offering Ankh symbols to both, suggesting they shared the same divine access and authority. The theological significance of Nefertiti's prominence becomes clearer when we consider the nature of Atenist theology. The Aten was understood as a creative force that brought all life into being. In Egyptian thought, creation required both masculine and feminine principles, the generative power and the receptive matrix, the seed and the womb. By showing Akhenaten and Nefertiti together, as co-worshippers and co-recipients of the Aten's life-giving rays, the artistic program suggested they embodied this divine duality, that together they manifested the creative power of the god on earth. Some scholars have gone further, suggesting that Nefertiti may have served as co-regent with Akhenaten, wielding actual political power rather than merely symbolic religious authority. The evidence for this is circumstantial but suggestive. In later years of Akhenaten's reign, texts mention a mysterious co-ruler named Ankheperur, Neferuaten, a name that includes elements clearly referencing Nefertiti. Some Egyptologists believe this was Nefertiti herself, ruling alongside Akhenaten and perhaps being groomed to succeed him. Others argue for a different interpretation, but the debate itself indicates how unusually prominent Nefertiti was. The royal daughters, at least 6 and possibly more, played an important role in the artistic and religious program of Amarna. The princesses appear in reliefs and paintings with their parents, witnessing royal ceremonies, participating in worship, present at official occasions. This emphasis on the royal family as a unit was unprecedented in Egyptian royal iconography. Previous pharaohs might be shown with their children in private, informal contexts, but not as central participants in the great affairs of state and religion. The inclusion of the daughters in religious art served multiple purposes. On one level, it emphasized the Aten's role as giver of life. Here was the royal couple, blessed with children, living proof of the gods' creative power. On another level, it reinforced the message that through the royal family flowed all access to the divine. Just as the Aten's rays touched the king and queen, so their blessing extended to the princesses and, by extension, to all Egypt. The art showing family intimacy was revolutionary. We see Akhenaten kissing Nefertiti, the couple eating together, the king playing with his daughters. These domestic scenes, so normal to modern sensibilities, violated ancient Egyptian artistic conventions that insisted on showing the pharaoh only in formal ritualistic contexts. By presenting himself as a father and husband, Akhenaten was making a theological statement. The divine was present in ordinary life, in human relationships, in the simple act of living in the light. The sacred and the secular collapsed into each other. Yet this artistic program of family unity and affection may mask more complex, perhaps darker realities. At least 2 of the royal daughters died during Akhenaten's reign, their deaths recorded in heartbreaking wall carvings that show the parents mourning. The causes of these deaths are unknown, disease, complications of childbirth or other factors, but infant and child mortality was high in the ancient world and even royal children were not immune. The deaths must have been devastating personal tragedies for Akhenaten and Nefertiti. There is also evidence of something deeply troubling, probable incest in the royal family. Some scholars believe Akhenaten may have married his own daughters, fathering children by them. The evidence is disputed and complex, involving interpretations of titles, artistic representations, and palace architecture. If true, such marriages would not have been unprecedented in Egyptian royal history, where brother-sister marriages occurred to maintain bloodline purity. But the possibility adds a disturbing dimension to the intimate family scenes so prominently displayed in Amarna art. Around year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, something happened to Nefertiti. She disappears from the historical record rather abruptly. No more relief show her participating in ceremonies. Her name ceases to appear in inscriptions. The scholarly debate about what happened is ongoing and heated. Did she die? If so, why is there no record of her funeral or tomb, no mourning scenes like those for the deceased daughters? Did she fall from favour, perhaps due to religious or political disagreements with Akhenaten? Did she take on a new identity? Perhaps the mysterious rewrote mentioned in later texts. One intriguing theory holds that Nefertiti did indeed become rewrote, serving as co-regent or even sole ruler after Akhenaten became incapacitated or died. This would mean she exercised actual pharaonic power, perhaps attempting to moderate some of her husband's more extreme religious policies, or to prepare for a restoration of traditional practice. The evidence is tantalizing but ultimately inconclusive, lost in the deliberate destruction of Amarna period records by later dynasties. What is clear is that Nefertiti's prominence during the height of the Amarna period was exceptional, and that her partnership with Akhenaten was central to how Atenism was presented to Egypt. She was not merely a consort, but a co-creator of the religious revolution, its public face alongside the king, a living embodiment of the feminine principle necessary for creation. Her beauty, so celebrated in ancient art and modern imagination, was in service of a theological vision that the royal couple together manifested divine creative power, that through their unity flowed the Aten's blessing to all Egypt. Yet the personal cost of this theological role must have been enormous. To be elevated to such prominence was also to be isolated, set apart from normal human relationships and expectations. Nefertiti lived in a world of ritual performance, where even private family moments were carved into temple walls for public viewing. She witnessed her husband's increasing obsession with theological purity, the growing resistance to his policies, the decline of Egypt's international position. She buried at least 2 of her daughters, and then, whether through death or some other cause, she vanished from history, leaving behind one of ancient Egypt's most haunting mysteries. The artistic images of the royal family, Akhenaten, Nefertiti and their daughters beneath the Aten's rays, became the iconic representation of Atenism. These images declared that the divine was present in family bonds, in love between husband and wife, in the blessing of children. It was in many ways a more human face for religion than the awesome, distant gods of tradition. But humanity, with all its vulnerabilities and sorrows, may have been too fragile a foundation for a revolution that was tearing apart the religious fabric of a civilization. While Akhenaten was preoccupied with religious revolution in his desert capital, the Egyptian empire his ancestors had built was beginning to crumble. For over a century, Egypt had dominated the ancient Near East militarily and politically. The conquests of Thutmose III had extended Egyptian control from Nubia deep in the south to Syria in the north. Tribute flowed from subject peoples. Egyptian garrisons and resident commissioners ensured compliance with pharaonic authority. It was a system that required constant attention, military readiness, and diplomatic finesse. Under Akhenaten, that system began to fail. The evidence for this failure comes primarily from the Amarna letters, that remarkable cache of diplomatic correspondence discovered in 1887 at the site of Akhenaten. These clay tablets, inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, preserve the desperate pleas of Egyptian vassals and allies, calling for help that never came, warning of threats that went unaddressed, begging for the pharaoh's attention while he remained focused on his theological obsessions. The Amarna letters reveal a Near East in crisis. The Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia, was expanding southward, threatening Egyptian interests in Syria. Local rulers in Canaan were at each other's throats, some remaining loyal to Egypt, others seeking independence or switching allegiance to rising powers. Groups called the Habiru, possibly connected to the later Hebrews, though the identification is controversial, were raiding settled areas, disrupting the established order. Egyptian vassals pleaded for troops, supplies, support, just some acknowledgement that the pharaoh still cared about his empire. The tone of many letters is anguished. Rib Hadda, the ruler of Byblos on the Lebanese coast, wrote again and again, describing how his territory was being overrun, how his neighbours were betraying Egypt, how he needed help immediately. His letters grow increasingly desperate over time, eventually recording his loss of almost all his territory and his eventual fate: deposition, exile, possibly death. All the while, the Egyptian court apparently did nothing. Aziru, the ruler of Amurru in Syria, plays a double game in the correspondence. He claims loyalty to Egypt while simultaneously expanding his territory at Egypt's expense and negotiating with the Hittites. Eventually, he defects openly to the Hittite side. Other vassals see this and begin to calculate whether loyalty to a distracted pharaoh serves their interests. The erosion of Egypt's position is not sudden but gradual. A slow-motion collapse as subjects realize that Egyptian power, so formidable in the past, has become unreliable. The letters from the great powers, Babylonia, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittites, reveal a different dynamic. These are not subjects but peers who corresponded with Egypt as equals. They call the pharaoh brother and address diplomatic matters like royal marriages, the exchange of valuable gifts, and boundary disputes. Under Akhenaten, these relationships also began to deteriorate. Expected gifts did not arrive or were deemed insufficient. Marriage negotiations stalled. The respect Egypt had commanded through military might and diplomatic skill eroded, as other powers sensed Egyptian weakness. What explains this neglect of foreign affairs? Akhenaten was not ignorant of events beyond Egypt. The diplomatic archive at Amarna shows that letters were being received, read, and sometimes answered. But the king's responses, when they came, were often inadequate. Sending small contingents of troops when large armies were needed, providing token support when substantial intervention was required, or simply acknowledging problems without taking action to solve them. The likeliest explanation is that Akhenaten's priorities had shifted entirely toward religious concerns. For him, establishing pure worship of the Aten, eradicating false gods, and building his ideal city took precedence over maintaining the empire. Perhaps he believed that if Egypt got its relationship with the divine right, earthly affairs would follow naturally. Or perhaps the foreign territories simply seemed less important than the theological transformation he was trying to achieve. Whatever his reasoning, the practical result was clear. Egyptian power and influence in the Near East declined significantly during his reign. Some scholars have argued that the decline of Egypt's position has been exaggerated, that the Amarna letters reflect local complaints and power struggles that were typical of the ancient Near East, that Egypt's actual control remained strong. But even if we discount some of the letters' rhetoric, the trajectory is unmistakable. Territory that had been securely under Egyptian control became contested. Vassals who had been reliable became unreliable. Allies and enemies alike perceived Egyptian weakness and acted accordingly. The military implications were serious. Egyptian policy in the empire required periodic military campaigns to cow potential rebels, rescue loyal vassals, and demonstrate that pharaonic power remained formidable. These campaigns served both practical and symbolic purposes. They secured tribute, protected trading routes, and reinforced the message that challenging Egypt was futile. Akhenaten seems to have conducted few if any such campaigns. There are no records of great military victories, no scenes of the king triumphant in battle, no long lists of booty and prisoners brought back to Egypt. This military passivity was unprecedented for an Egyptian pharaoh. Every previous ruler of the 18th dynasty had been, to some degree, a warrior king, who personally led armies, or at least took credit for military victories. The pharaoh's role as defender of Maat included defending Egypt's borders and interests through military force when necessary. By neglecting this role, Akhenaten was violating one of kingship's fundamental responsibilities. the economic consequences of imperial decline would have been significant. Tribute from subject territories had enriched Egypt, providing luxury goods, raw materials, and labour. As control weakened, this flow of wealth decreased. Meanwhile, Akhenaten's domestic building projects, the rapid construction of Akhenaten, the maintenance of multiple temple complexes, the support of a large court, required enormous resources. The financial strain must have been considerable. Within Egypt itself, the neglect of foreign affairs may have been less immediately apparent than the religious changes. Ordinary Egyptians probably knew little about Syrian politics or Hittite expansion, but the elite, generals, administrators, diplomats, would have been acutely aware of what was being lost. Here was another source of alienation from Akhenaten's regime, another group with reasons to resent the king's single-minded focus on religious reform at the expense of other royal responsibilities. The situation on Egypt's northern border was mirrored in the south, in Nubia. This region had been conquered generations earlier and was administered as Egyptian territory, a source of gold and other valuable resources. Under Akhenaten, Egyptian control in Nubia seems to have been maintained more successfully than in the Northern Empire, perhaps because the religious changes were less disruptive there, or because competent viceroys managed affairs independently. But even in Nubia, there are signs of strain and occasional rebellion that required military response. The irony is painful. Akhenaten's theology emphasized the Aten as universal, as creator and sustainer of all peoples, Egyptian, Nubian, Syrian, and all others. The great hymn explicitly celebrated human diversity as divine creation. Yet in practice, Akhenaten's policies led to Egypt's weakening position among those very peoples, to the loss of influence and territory, to the suffering of allies who trusted in Egyptian protection and found themselves abandoned. This gap between theological universalism and political particularism is one of the revolution's central contradictions. The Aten religion proclaimed unity and equal divine love for all humanity, but it was imposed by an Egyptian pharaoh on Egyptian subjects, and it contributed to the weakening of Egypt's actual relationships with foreign peoples. The vision was universal, but its implementation was narrow, serving ultimately to isolate Egypt rather than connect it to the wider world. As the empire's edges frayed, as desperate letters piled up in the archives at Akhenaten, as Egyptian prestige declined in the eyes of friend and foe alike, Akhenaten remained focused on his solar temples and theological purity. The sun rose each morning over the cliffs east of Amarna, its rays touching the royal city with impartial light. But beyond those cliffs, beyond the desert horizon, the darkness was gathering, not the natural darkness of night that the Aten's return would dispel, but the darkness of political chaos, of lost opportunities, also of consequences that would outlast the pharaoh's reign and nearly undo all that his ancestors had built. The Year of Radiance. The 12th year of Akhenaten's reign marked both an apex and a turning point. In that year, the king and queen hosted what seems to have been an elaborate celebration at Akhenaten, an occasion so significant that it was commemorated in multiple tombs and recorded in the artistic program of the city's temples. This event, which scholars call the Durbar of Year 12 based on tomb inscriptions, represented the moment when Akhenaten's vision appeared to have achieved its fullest realization. The reliefs depicting this celebration show a grand festival of international scope. Foreign delegations arrive bearing tribute. Nubians from the south, Syrians from the northeast, Libyans from the west, peoples from throughout Egypt's sphere of influence. They bring gold, ivory, exotic animals, fine woods, precious stones, all the wealth of the known world laid at the feet of the pharaoh. The images show Akhenaten and Nefertiti, their daughters beside them. Receiving this homage beneath the Aten's rays, it is a vision of empire renewed, of international recognition, of Egypt's centrality maintained despite the shift from Thebes to Amarna. The tone of these reliefs is triumphant. Here, they seem to say, is proof that Akhenaten's religious revolution has succeeded, that Egypt's power remains undiminished. that the Aten has blessed its devoted servant with prosperity and respect from all nations. The artistic quality is superb, showing the Amarna style at its most accomplished. Naturalistic detail, elaborate costumes, individual faces rendered with care, a sense of joyous celebration. Yet beneath the triumphalism, closer examination reveals complexities and perhaps contradictions. The foreign tribute depicted may be as much diplomatic fiction as reality, a conventional way of representing international relations that masked a more complicated situation. Some of the delegations shown may never have actually arrived. The tribute may have been exaggerated or invented. The artistic program was presenting an ideal version of events, a vision of how these things should be rather than how they actually were. We know from the Amarna letters that this same period saw continued erosion of Egypt's position in Syria and Canaan. The year 12, Durbar may have been, in part, an attempt to project strength and assert continued dominion, precisely because that dominion was increasingly uncertain. It was propaganda, albeit propaganda that Akhenaten himself may have believed, creating an image of successful empire to counter growing reality of imperial decline. The festivals of this period focused entirely on solar worship. The daily rhythm of Aten services reached its most elaborate form. At dawn, Akhenaten would emerge from the royal residence to greet the rising sun, performing rituals of offering and praise. These morning services drew from traditional Egyptian solar hymns, but adapted them to Atenist theology, emphasizing the sun disk as sole creator rather than as one aspect of Ra, or manifestation of other solar deities. The hymns sung during these ceremonies, many presumably composed by or at the direction of Akhenaten himself, represented the literary pinnacle of the Amarna period. They combined theological sophistication with genuine poetry, describing the Aten's daily journey across the sky, its life-giving properties, the joy of worshipping in its light. For those who embraced the new religion, these moments must have been powerful, standing in the open air as the sun broke over the eastern cliffs, flooding the temple precincts with light, singing praises to the source of all life. Midday services acknowledged the sun at its zenith, when the Aten's power was most evident, when shadow shortened to nothing, when the heat was most intense. Evening ceremonies marked the sunset, that daily moment when the world darkened and the god's visible presence departed, only to return with certainty the next dawn. This daily cycle became the heartbeat of Amarna life, replacing the complex festival calendar of traditional Egyptian religion with a simpler but more regular pattern tied directly to natural phenomena. The artistic production of this period shows confidence and sophistication. The workshops of Amarna turned out not only monumental relief sculpture for temples and tombs, but also smaller objects, painted pottery, jewellery, furniture inlays, cosmetic containers that brought the Amarna aesthetic into private life. The naturalistic style influenced everything from architectural decoration to the design of everyday objects. A new visual culture was being created, one that reflected and reinforced Atenist theology's emphasis on direct observation of the natural world. This was the period when Thutmose created his famous bust of Nefertiti, that masterpiece of ancient portraiture that has captivated viewers for a century since its modern discovery. The bust shows not an idealized queen, but a specific individual, the elegant neck, the refined features, the direct gaze, and intriguingly one eye left unpainted, perhaps deliberately, perhaps because the work was a model rather than a finished piece. The technical accomplishment is extraordinary, demonstrating that the Amarna workshops had reached a level of sophistication that matched or exceeded anything in Egypt's long artistic tradition. For the true believers, for those who had fully embraced Akhenaten's vision, this must have seemed like vindication. They had left Thebes, abandoned the old gods, built a new capital on empty sand, and look what they had created: a thriving city, magnificent temples, beautiful art, coherent theology that made sense of the world. The king who had seemed radical and disturbing now appeared visionary. The religion that had seemed harsh and reductive now appeared pure and enlightened. The future looked bright, literally bathed in the light of the Aten. But at the height of achievement, the first shadows began to appear. Not the ordinary shadows cast by objects in sunlight, but the shadows of coming disaster. In year 12 or shortly after, a plague struck Amarna. We know this from skeletal remains showing signs of epidemic disease and from inscriptions that reference a great illness. The exact nature of the disease is unknown. Perhaps smallpox, perhaps plague, perhaps some other infectious disease that spread through the densely populated city. The epidemic was devastating. It may have killed thousands, including members of the royal family. At least one of the royal daughters died during this period, memorialized in heartbreaking relief scenes that show her parents mourning. The theological implications must have been troubling. If the Aten was the source of all life, the beneficent creator who sustained his creations, how did one explain epidemic disease? Why would the God who loved all the peoples equally allow such suffering? Traditional Egyptian religion had answers to such questions. Illness could be attributed to angry gods who needed to be appeased, to demons that required magical protection, to violations of Mayat that disrupted cosmic order. Priests could perform rituals, doctors could invoke divine aid, and individuals could pray to specific deities known to help with particular ailments. But Atenism, with its simplified theology and rejection of traditional divine intermediaries, offered fewer resources for making sense of suffering. The plague was not merely a natural disaster, but a theological crisis. It raised questions about the Aten's nature and power, about whether the exclusive focus on solar worship had somehow left Egypt vulnerable, about whether the old gods, if they existed, were angry at being abandoned. For Akhenaten, whose entire reign was predicated on the absolute truth of his religious vision, such questions must have been deeply unsettling. Additional personal tragedies struck the royal family. Evidence suggests that Nefertiti either died or fell from prominence during this period. If she died, Akhenaten lost not just his wife, but his partner in the religious revolution, the co-manifestation of the divine creative power, the feminine half of the theological dyad that had been central to Atenism's presentation. The loss would have been both personally devastating and religiously significant. Some scholars believe that another princess died as well, and that once or more of Akhenaten's daughters may have been elevated to the position of great royal wife, perhaps bearing children to their own father in an attempt to ensure the succession. If true, this would represent a descent into desperation, an attempt to maintain the divine royal family, even as death tore it apart. The year 12, Durbar, that moment of apparent triumph, was followed almost immediately by catastrophe. Within months, or perhaps a year or two, the royal family had been devastated by disease and death. The vibrant, confident vision of Atenism at its height gave way to something darker and more troubled. The light that had seemed so certain began to flicker. Archaeological evidence from this period shows signs of declining prosperity. Building projects that had been undertaken with such energy began to slow or stop. The quality of construction and decoration in later structures is noticeably inferior to that of the earlier years. Resources were being stretched thin, whether from plague disruption, economic mismanagement, loss of foreign tribute, or some combination of factors. In the provinces, away from Amarna's immediate control, local officials began hedging their bets, quietly maintaining or restoring elements of traditional worship even while nominally supporting the king's religious policies. The system of religious suppression required constant vigilance and enforcement, and as the king's attention was drawn to personal tragedy and as his resources became constrained, that enforcement weakened. The radiant year when Akhenaten's vision had seemed to reach its fullest expression, when delegates from across the known world brought tribute to Amarna's temples, when art and architecture and theology all aligned in a coherent whole, that year was also the beginning of the end. The apex contained within it the seeds of collapse. The light that had burned so bright was beginning to consume itself, and in its failing glow, the old darkness waited to return. Shadows in the sun. The final years of Akhenaten's reign are shrouded in uncertainty and tragedy. The historical record becomes fragmentary, confused, marked by erasures and deletions as later generations tried to erase this uncomfortable period from memory. What we can reconstruct suggests a king increasingly isolated, his grand vision crumbling, his personal life devastated by loss, his grip on power weakening even as his devotion to the Aten remained absolute. The plague that struck Amarna seems to have recurred or persisted, creating a lasting crisis. Skeletal remains from the cemetery at Amarna show high mortality rates and signs of disease stress. The population may have declined as people fled the stricken city or simply died. The vision of Akhenaten as a paradise of light gave way to the reality of a city dealing with epidemic disease, food shortages, and declining morale. The food shortages themselves are revealing. Akhenaten's location, while symbolically perfect for Akhenaten's purposes, had practical disadvantages. The site had no great agricultural hinterland, no established network of supply and support. The city depended entirely on supplies brought from elsewhere, and as resources became strained, as administrative systems broke down, as foreign tribute ceased flowing, feeding the population became increasingly difficult. Evidence from tombs and archaeological sites suggests that the ambitious building program of the early years gave way to more modest efforts in the later period. Some structures were left unfinished, others show hasty or poor quality construction, as if resources and skilled labour were no longer available. The workshops that had produced such magnificent art in the early years seem to have declined in output and quality. The question of succession became acute. With several royal daughters dead and Nefertiti either deceased or departed from the scene, who would inherit the throne? There are references to a co-ruler during Akhenaten's final years, identified as Smenkhkare or Ankheperure, but this figure's identity and relationship to Akhenaten remain hotly debated. Was this another royal prince? A son-in-law who married one of the surviving daughters? Nefertiti under another name? The evidence is contradictory and incomplete. What seems clear is that Akhenaten recognized the fragility of his religious revolution. A co-ruler could ensure continuity, could maintain the Aten worship after the founding pharaoh's death, but finding an appropriate heir who combined royal blood, religious commitment, and the ability to rule proved difficult. The succession crisis was not merely a matter of royal lineage, but of theological continuity. Without a committed successor, everything Akhenaten had built might be swept away. The king's own health appears to have declined in these final years. The distinctive physical characteristics visible in the artistic representations, the elongated skull, protruding belly, unusual proportions, if they represented actual physical conditions rather than symbolic art, may indicate a genetic disorder that worsened with age. Or perhaps the stress of his reign, the personal losses, the resistance to his policies, the growing evidence that his vision was failing. Perhaps all this took a toll that manifested in physical decline. Psychologically, Akhenaten must have been in an impossible position. He had staked everything on the absolute truth of his religious revelation. He had torn down temples, closed sanctuaries, erased divine names, built a new capital, imposed his vision on all of Egypt. He had sacrificed foreign policy, possibly the empire itself, to his theological obsessions. And now, in the plague, in his family's deaths, in the mounting evidence of failure, reality was providing a harsh judgment on his choices. Yet there is no indication that Akhenaten ever doubted his vision. No inscription suggests second thoughts. No artistic representation shows compromise with the old ways. If anything, the evidence suggests he doubled down, maintaining absolute loyalty to the Aten even as everything else fell apart. This unwavering commitment could be interpreted as heroic faith or as dangerous fanaticism, depending on one's perspective. The international situation continued to deteriorate. The Amarna letters from this period show increasing desperation from Egyptian vassals and presumption from enemies. The Hittite Empire absorbed territory that had been Egyptian. Former subjects stopped sending tribute, stopped acknowledging pharaonic authority. The empire that Thutmose III had conquered, that Amenhotep III had maintained through skilled diplomacy, was slipping away. Domestically, the strain was showing in other ways. The priesthood of Amun in Thebes, though officially suppressed, had not been destroyed. The temples might be closed, but the priests remained, biding their time, maintaining networks of influence, waiting for the opportunity to restore traditional worship. In the provinces, local officials increasingly ignored directives from Amarna, returning to old practices or simply maintaining order as best they could without clear guidance from a distracted central authority. The army, that traditional backbone of pharaonic power, seems to have been alienated by Akhenaten's pacifism and religious extremism. Generals who had served under previous pharaohs, who understood military necessity and the requirements of maintaining an empire, found themselves sidelined in favour of religious officials and Aten devotees. The military establishment's loyalty to the regime must have been increasingly questionable. Evidence from tombs at Amarna shows that even officials close to Akhenaten began hedging their theological bets in these later years. Some tombs show more traditional iconography alongside Atenist elements. Prayers include phrases that could be interpreted as addressing traditional deities or at least leaving room for them. The absolute confidence of the early years was giving way to uncertainty and hedging of positions. The contradiction of Akhenaten's position became stark. He ruled as pharaoh, claiming all the traditional authority of Egyptian kingship, but that authority had always rested, theologically, on the pharaoh's role as the chosen of the gods, plural, and the maintainer of Ma'at through proper worship of the entire pantheon. Rejecting the traditional gods, Akhenaten had undercut the very foundations of his own authority. Why should anyone obey a pharaoh who violated the most fundamental requirements of kingship? The answer, for Akhenaten, was that he served a higher truth. The Aten was real, and the other gods were false. Therefore, obedience to him was obedience to truth itself, regardless of tradition. But this was a hard argument to sell to a population that experienced his reign as disruption, loss, and suffering. For them, the old ways had worked. Life had meaning. The gods had been present. Ma'at had been maintained. The new way brought only confusion and hardship. In the final inscribed references to Akhenaten, there is a quality of increasingly desperate affirmation. The king proclaims his devotion to the Aten with mounting intensity, as if repetition could make it more true, as if the volume of his faith could compensate for its growing isolation. He had no converts beyond his immediate circle. Egypt had not embraced his vision, but endured it, waiting for it to pass. The sun continued to rise each morning over the cliffs of Amarna, its rays touching the empty courts of the temples, illuminating the royal residence where an aging king clung to his vision even as it crumbled. The Aten gave light impartially, indifferently, caring nothing for the aspirations of the man who had devoted his life to its worship. The theology had always stressed the sun's universal beneficence, its blessing on all peoples and all creation. What it had not addressed was what happened when that beneficence seemed indistinguishable from indifference, when the light shone equally on success and failure, life and death, revelation and delusion. Akhenaten must have known in some part of his mind that his revolution was failing. He must have seen the unfinished buildings, the declining population, the plague's devastation, the mounting evidence of imperial collapse. Yet he persisted, because to abandon his vision would be to admit that everything, all the disruption, all the suffering, all the destruction of the old ways, had been for nothing. Better to maintain the faith, to insist on the truth of the revelation, to die believing in the light even as shadows gathered. The death of the prophet. Akhenaten died in approximately 1326 or 334 BCE, somewhere between the 17th and 19th year of his reign. The circumstances of his death remain unknown. No tomb inscription describes it, no contemporary document records it, no reliable tradition preserves it. Retry. Continue. We have only the silence that follows, the abrupt transition from a reign of radical transformation to the careful restoration of the old order. Whether Akhenaten died of disease, whether his unusual physical characteristics indicated a condition that eventually proved fatal, whether plague claimed him as it had claimed so many others, or whether his death involved more sinister circumstances, these questions remain unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. The royal tomb prepared for Akhenaten in the wadi east of Amarna was never completed to the standard originally intended. The burial chamber exists carved deep into the rock, designed to catch the first rays of the rising sun. Fragments of his sarcophagus have been found, smashed and damaged, inscribed with protective texts that invoke the Aten rather than the traditional funerary deities. But whether Akhenaten was actually buried there, whether his mummy remained undisturbed or was later removed, whether he received proper funerary rites according to his own reformed theology, or was buried according to hastily restored traditional practices, all of this is uncertain. Some scholars have suggested that the mummy discovered in tomb Cave 5 in the Valley of the Kings, moved there from Amarna during the restoration period, might be Akhenaten. The skeletal remains are those of a young man, perhaps in his 20s or early 30s, with unusual cranial features that could match the artistic representations of Akhenaten. DNA analysis has linked this individual to Tutankhamun, suggesting a close family relationship. But the identification remains controversial, complicated by uncertainties about the mummy's age at death and the reliability of ancient DNA evidence. What is certain is that Akhenaten's death marked the beginning of the end for his religious revolution. The succession that followed was confused and contested. The mysterious Smenkhkare, who had apparently served as co-regent in Akhenaten's final years, either died almost immediately or never really existed as a separate individual. Within a year or two of Akhenaten's death, a child was on the throne, Tutankhaten, probably around 9 years old, the son of Akhenaten by one of his wives, possibly by his own daughter. This boy king was hardly in a position to maintain his father's radical religious policies even had he wanted to. Real power lay with the advisors who surrounded the throne, men like the aging courtier who had been close to Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and Horemheb, the general who commanded whatever remained of Egypt's military power. These men had to make a choice: continue the Atenist revolution that was clearly failing, or engineer a return to traditional ways that would stabilize Egypt and restore the institutions that had been so badly disrupted. They chose restoration, and they did it swiftly. Within a few years of Akhenaten's death, the young king's name was changed from Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. The name change was not merely symbolic but programmatic, announcing a return to orthodoxy. The court left Amarna and returned to Memphis and Thebes. The temples of the traditional gods were reopened, the priesthoods were restored, the old rituals resumed. A stela erected during Tutankhamun's reign, known as the Restoration Stela, describes in detail the state of Egypt that the young king inherited and the measures taken to correct it. The language is damning in what it implies about Akhenaten's reign, though the heretic pharaoh himself is not named. The temples of the gods and goddesses, from Elephantine to the marshes of the delta, had gone to pieces. Their shrines had become desolate, had become mounds overgrown with weeds. Their sanctuaries were as if they had never been. Their halls were a footpath. The land was topsy-turvy, and the gods turned their backs upon this land. If the army was sent to Syria to extend the borders of Egypt, they had no success at all. If one prayed to a god to seek counsel from him, he would never come. If one made supplication to a goddess similarly, she would never come at all. Their hearts were hurt in their bodies, so they did damage to that which had been made. The stela continues by describing Tutankhamun's restoration efforts, rebuilding temples, recasting divine statues in gold and precious stones, endowing priesthoods with land and servants, reinstating the old festivals, essentially reversing everything Akhenaten had done. The traditional gods were welcomed back, their sanctuaries restored, their worship re-established. Egypt breathed again, released from the theological straitjacket Akhenaten had imposed. The evaluation expressed in the Restoration Stela represents the official judgment of Akhenaten's reign. It had been a disaster, a time when the gods abandoned Egypt because Egypt had abandoned them. The military failures, the plague, the economic difficulties, all were interpreted as divine punishment for theological error. The restoration of traditional worship would restore Ma'at, would bring the gods back, would make Egypt whole again. For those who had believed in Akhenaten's vision, who had embraced the Aten and rejected the old gods, the restoration must have been profoundly disorienting. Everything they had been taught was true was now declared false. The god they had worshipped exclusively was being marginalized. The king who had been the voice of ultimate truth was being erased from memory. The choice was stark: recant or resist. Most chose to recant, at least publicly. Resistance would have been futile and dangerous. The sun that Akhenaten had worshipped and continued to rise over Egypt, indifferent to human theological disputes. It shone on the reopened temples of Amun, as it had shone on Akhenaten's 10 sanctuaries. Its rays touched Thebes as they had touched Amarna. The physical sun, that concrete reality Akhenaten had pointed to as proof of his god's existence, provided no confirmation or denial of any theological position. It simply was, doing what it had always done, giving light and warmth to all beneath it, without regard for how humans chose to interpret that light. Akhenaten had sought to build a religion on the solid foundation of observable natural phenomenon, the sun's daily journey, its obvious role in sustaining life, its visibility to all. He had thought this would create a faith more true than one based on hidden gods and ancient myths. But in the end, the physical sun proved to be too simple a foundation for the complex human needs that religion addresses. People wanted more than light. They wanted stories, meanings, connections, answers to questions about suffering and death and purpose that no amount of sunlight could provide. As Akhenaten was being buried in his tomb beneath the cliffs of Amarna, as the priests who officiated may have been already planning to abandon the city forever, as advisors around the young Tutankhamun debated how quickly and completely to dismantle the Atenist experiment, the question hung in the desert air: what had it all been for? What had been accomplished by the decades of disruption, the destruction of temples, the suppression of ancient worship, the building and abandonment of a capital city? The answer from the perspective of those who came after was clear: nothing good had been accomplished. Akhenaten had been a failure, his reign a cautionary tale, his god a delusion. The work of restoration was the work of correcting terrible mistakes, of healing wounds, of returning Egypt to its proper path. This view would become orthodox, would shape how later Egyptians remembered or tried to forget the Amarna period. But perhaps there was another answer, one that the sun worshipper himself might have given in his final moments. Perhaps he died believing he had been faithful to truth, that he had seen what others refused to see, that he had tried to turn humanity's face toward the light. Perhaps he believed that even if his revolution failed in his lifetime, the seed had been planted, the vision had been articulated, and someday, somehow, people would understand what he had tried to do. Perhaps he died in faith, still believing in the light, even as the darkness prepared to reclaim his monuments and erase his name. The sun he worshipped set behind Amarna's western cliffs, and did not rise for him again, but it rose for Egypt the next morning and the next, as it had always done, as it always would, caring nothing for prophets or kings or the revolutions they attempted. The light was eternal, indifferent, and utterly silent about the meaning of the life that had been devoted to its worship. The Restoration. The reign of Tutankhamun, though brief, he ruled for only about 10 years and died around age 18, was crucial in determining Egypt's path forward after the Amarna experiment. The young king himself, elevated to the throne as a child, was likely more symbol than actor in the restoration. Real power lay with his advisors, particularly the Vizier I and the General Horemheb, men who had navigated Akhenaten's reign and now saw the opportunity to reverse its most damaging effects while preserving their own positions. The restoration began gradually, perhaps while Akhenaten still lived, or immediately after his death. The first steps were practical rather than explicitly ideological. The court needed to return to established centres of power where infrastructure, resources, and institutional support existed. Amarna, for all its symbolic importance to Akhenaten, was a new city without deep roots, expensive to maintain, dependent on constantly supplied resources, lacking the accumulated wealth and institutional foundations of traditional capitals. The move back to Memphis and Thebes was presented as a return to normalcy, a recognition that the experiment had failed and that Egypt needed to reclaim its heritage. Tutankhamun's name change from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun made the message unmistakable. The Aten was being demoted, and Amun was reclaiming his position as king of the gods. This was not merely a personal preference, but a state policy, a declaration that the traditional religious order would be restored. The reopening of the traditional temples required more than simply unlocking doors. Years or even decades of neglect had left these once magnificent institutions in disrepair. Roofs had collapsed, walls had crumbled, equipment had been stolen or destroyed, estates had been reassigned, priesthoods had been scattered. The Restoration Stela describes the temples as going to pieces, becoming mounds overgrown with weeds, their halls a footpath. The hyperbole was probably exaggerated for effect, but the basic situation was real. Egypt's religious infrastructure had been badly damaged and needed substantial investment to restore. Tutankhamun's government undertook this restoration with vigour. Craftsmen were commissioned to create new divine statues to replace those that had been destroyed or appropriated. These statues were to be made of the finest gold and silver and precious stones, according to the Restoration Stela, demonstrating that substantial resources were being directed toward religious restoration. Temple estates were reconstituted, lands returned or reassigned, workers provided. Priesthoods were reconvened, with positions filled by those who had maintained the old traditions or their descendants. The economic impact of this restoration was significant. Temple complexes were not merely religious institutions but economic engines, employing thousands, owning vast agricultural lands, operating workshops and trading networks. Restoring them meant restoring a major segment of Egypt's economy. The priesthood of Amun in particular regained enormous power and wealth, perhaps even more than they had held before Akhenaten's suppression, since they were now seen as having been vindicated by the failure of the Atenist experiment. The restoration of temple festivals and rituals brought back the rich calendrical cycle that had structured Egyptian life for millennia. Once again, the sacred bark of Amun would process through Thebes during the Opet festival. Once again, the beautiful festival of the valley would celebrate the connection between living and dead. Once again, the countless local festivals honouring particular deities would mark the agricultural year and punctuate the rhythm of community life. For ordinary Egyptians, this return to familiar religious patterns must have been deeply reassuring after years of disruption and uncertainty. Yet the restoration was not simply a return to the status quo ante. Egypt had been changed by the Amarna period in ways that could not be completely undone. The old religious certainties had been questioned, the divine order had been challenged, and even though traditional worship was restored, a kind of theological innocence had been lost. Egyptians now knew that their ancient gods could be rejected by a pharaoh, that temples could be closed, that names could be erased. The absolute confidence in the eternal stability of the traditional order had been shaken. Artistic styles also showed the Amarna period's lasting influence. While there was a return to more traditional iconography and conventions, Egyptian art after Amarna retained some of the naturalism and humanity that had characterized the Amarna style. Royal figures continued to be shown with their families more often than before. The stark formalism of pre-Amarna art never fully returned. Even in restoration, Akhenaten's influence persisted in subtle ways. The relationship between kingship and religion had also been fundamentally altered by the Amarna experience. Akhenaten had demonstrated that a pharaoh could impose his religious vision on Egypt, that royal power could extend even to determining which gods existed. This was a dangerous precedent. Future rulers would need to be more careful about maintaining the traditional order, lest they provoke the kind of chaos that Akhenaten had created. The restoration thus involved not just rebuilding temples, but also re-establishing limits on royal theological innovation. Tutankhamun's reign saw significant investment in monumental architecture beyond temple restoration. The young king commissioned statues, buildings, and other monuments that proclaimed the return to traditional values. His own burial, though cut short by his unexpected death, was provided for with elaborate grave goods that followed traditional funerary practices, appeals to Osiris, protective deities painted on shrine walls, all the apparatus of the old religion that Akhenaten had tried to eliminate. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb by Howard Carter in 1922, nearly intact after 3,000 years, gave the modern world an unparalleled glimpse into the wealth and artistry of New Kingdom Egypt. The golden mask, the elaborate shrines, the chariots and weapons and furniture, all of this reflected the restoration of traditional patterns of royal burial. It also demonstrated that despite Akhenaten's religious revolution and its economic disruptions, Egypt retained enormous resources and skilled craftsmen capable of creating objects of extraordinary beauty. The political dimension of the restoration involved careful maneuvering by those in power. Who may have been Nefertiti's father and who had been a senior official under Akhenaten, successfully positioned himself as a key figure in the restoration. He balanced his connections to the Amarna regime with his support for traditional religion, demonstrating a political flexibility that allowed him to survive the transition. When Tutankhamun died without an heir, claimed the throne himself, ruling briefly before being succeeded by Horemheb. Horemheb, the general, took the restoration further. His reign saw increasingly explicit rejection of the Amarna period and systematic efforts to erase it from history. He dated his reign not from his own accession, but from Amenhotep III's death, effectively declaring the entire Amarna period, Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun and to have been an illegitimate interruption of proper rule. In king lists, he would be recorded as the immediate successor to Amenhotep III, with the Amarna pharaoh simply omitted. This attempt at historical erasure was remarkably successful for ancient times. Later generations of Egyptians knew little or nothing about Akhenaten and his revolution. The heretic pharaoh became that criminal or the rebel in the few texts that mentioned him at all. His monuments were systematically destroyed, his names chiselled out, his city abandoned to the desert. For 3,000 years the story of Akhenaten would be almost completely lost, preserved only in fragments and in the ruins of his abandoned capital. Yet the restoration, for all its thoroughness, could not completely erase what had happened. The Amarna letters survived buried in the ruins of Akhenaten, preserving the diplomatic correspondence of the period. The tombs at Amarna, though vandalized, retained their inscriptions and reliefs. The boundary stelae carved into the cliffs remained, weathered but readable, and in the memories of those who had lived through the period, memories passed down perhaps in whispers, in unofficial traditions, in stories told privately, the knowledge of what Akhenaten had attempted remained, waiting to be rediscovered. The restoration of traditional religion after Akhenaten's death represented Egypt's powerful conservative instincts, its drive to maintain cosmic and social order through adherence to time-tested practices. The Amarna period had been experienced as trauma, as disruption of Ma'at, and the restoration was experienced as healing, as a return to health. The old gods had been vindicated, the old ways proven correct, the old order re-established. Egypt could breathe again, could resume its eternal patterns, could forget the uncomfortable episode when a pharaoh had tried to transform everything according to his singular vision. But forgetting is never complete. The past leaves traces. Monuments crumble but do not entirely disappear, and eventually, in time's long arc, even deliberately buried truths resurface. The desert sand that covered Amarna's ruins would also preserve them, and the sun that Akhenaten worshipped would one day shine on archaeologists who would bring his story back to light. The erasure. The systematic destruction of Akhenaten's legacy began during the restoration under Tutankhamun and Ay, but reached its fullest expression under Horemheb and the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty. This was not merely passive neglect or natural decay, but active, deliberate erasure, an attempt to remove the heretic pharaoh from history itself to make it as if his reign had never occurred. The methods of erasure were comprehensive and methodical. Wherever Akhenaten's name appeared in cartouches, those oval frames that enclosed royal names, it was chiselled out, the hieroglyphs hammered away until only a blank space or rough depression remained. In some cases, the name was replaced with that of a legitimate predecessor or successor. In other cases, generic phrases like "that rebel" or "the enemy" were substituted. The goal was clear: Akhenaten's name should not be spoken, should not be written, should not exist. Images of Akhenaten suffered similar treatment. Statues were systematically smashed, their pieces sometimes buried, sometimes reused as fill in later construction projects. Reliefs showing the king were defaced, his figure hacked away, his distinctive features obliterated. The colossal statues that had stood in the Aten temples at Karnak were demolished, their fragments used to fill the pylons of later temples, hidden inside the monuments of legitimate pharaohs. These statues would remain hidden for millennia, until modern archaeologists discovered them and painstakingly reassembled them. The Aten temples themselves were dismantled. At Karnak, Horemheb and his successors tore down the structures Akhenaten had built, removing the thousands of Talatat blocks and repurposing them for other construction. Because these blocks were relatively small and uniform, they were useful as fill material. Thus Akhenaten's temples disappeared into the cores of later buildings, their decorated surfaces hidden but preserved, waiting for modern discovery. At Amarna itself, the royal city was systematically abandoned. The population left, returning to traditional centres or dispersing to other locations. Buildings were left to the elements, subjected to deliberate vandalism, or dismantled for their materials. The temples were particularly targeted, altars smashed, stelae broken, any object of religious significance destroyed. The royal tomb in the eastern wadi was violated, Akhenaten's burial disturbed, his sarcophagus damaged. If his mummy was ever properly interred there, it was removed, perhaps to be reburied elsewhere, perhaps to be destroyed outright. The tombs of Akhenaten's officials at Amarna were also vandalized. Reliefs were defaced, hieroglyphs erased, scenes of Aten worship attacked with particular vigour. Yet these same vandals sometimes left untouched scenes that showed natural life, birds, plants, animals, suggesting that the destruction was specifically targeted at religious content rather than being random vandalism. This was theological warfare waged with hammers and chisels. The boundary stelae that Akhenaten had carved into the cliffs with such care, proclaiming the eternal nature of his capital and his devotion to the Aten, were attacked but proved difficult to completely destroy because of their scale and location. The carved surfaces were damaged, the king's figures defaced, but the texts remained partially legible, preserving Akhenaten's own words about his intentions and beliefs. These stelae would later prove invaluable to archaeologists trying to understand the Amarna period. The erasure extended to administrative records. King lists were revised to exclude Akhenaten and his immediate successors. The Abydos king list, carved during the 19th dynasty reign of Seti-Pheres, jumps directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, as if the entire Amarna period had never occurred. The Turin king list, a papyrus document listing all pharaohs, either omits or gives minimal space to the Amarna rulers. Later historical and religious texts simply ignore the period or refer to it obliquely as a time of troubles. This official erasure had a chilling effect on anyone who might have been tempted to discuss or preserve memories of the period. Speaking positively about Akhenaten or the Aten religion could be construed as rebellion against the restored order, perhaps even as heresy. Those who had served in prominent positions during the Amarna period had to carefully distance themselves from that service, emphasizing their role in the restoration rather than their earlier careers. The pressure to forget was intense. Yet ironically, the very thoroughness of the destruction aided preservation in certain ways. The Talatat blocks reused as fill in later temples at Karnak were protected by the structures that enclosed them. When these temples themselves fell into ruin centuries later, the Amarna blocks were revealed, thousands upon thousands of them like a massive jigsaw puzzle waiting to be reassembled. Modern archaeologists have spent decades working with these blocks, using computer analysis to match fragments and reconstruct Akhenaten's temples virtually. At Amarna, the rapid abandonment of the city meant that many ordinary objects were left behind. Pottery, tools, household items, administrative documents. The city's relatively brief occupation period meant that archaeological layers were less disturbed than in long-occupied sites. When excavation began in the late 19th and 20th centuries, Amarna provided an unusually clear snapshot of life in a particular moment of Egyptian history. The very completeness of its abandonment made it archaeologically valuable. The Amarna letters, that extraordinary cache of diplomatic correspondence, survived because they were on clay tablets rather than the papyrus normally used for administrative documents in Egypt. Clay is far more durable than papyrus, especially in dry conditions. When the royal archive at Amarna was abandoned, these tablets were left behind, to be discovered thousands of years later by a local woman digging for fertilizer. She had no idea of their historical value, and some tablets may have been destroyed before their importance was recognized. But those that survived opened a window into international relations during Akhenaten's reign. The psychological dimension of this erasure campaign is fascinating to consider. Those who systematically destroyed Akhenaten's monuments and erased his names were often people who had lived through his reign, perhaps even served him. Now they were doing their best to pretend he had never existed. What did it feel like to chisel away the name of a pharaoh you had once bowed before? What rationalizations were necessary? The official position was that Akhenaten had violated Ma'at, had disrupted cosmic order, and that erasing his memory was a righteous act of restoration. But surely some of those doing the physical work of erasure must have felt the strangeness of it, the unsettling task of making history disappear. The campaign succeeded remarkably well by ancient standards. Within a few generations, Akhenaten had become a dim memory at best, a cautionary tale perhaps told quietly about what happened when pharaohs strayed too far from tradition. By the late period of Egyptian history, 1,000 years after Akhenaten's death, he was completely forgotten by the Egyptians themselves. The classical authors, Greek and Roman writers who described Egypt, never mentioned him. He had been successfully erased from the continuous historical memory of Egyptian civilization, yet total erasure proved impossible. The monuments at Amarna remained, buried in sand but not destroyed. The inscriptions, though damaged, retained enough detail to eventually be read. The artistic style was so distinctive that when fragments began to be discovered in the 19th century, scholars quickly recognized they came from a unique period, and the very fact that so much effort had been expended to erase Akhenaten suggested that he had been important, that something significant had occurred that later generations desperately wanted to forget. The erasure was an act of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, a practice known in various ancient cultures. The logic was that identity and immortality were sustained through remembered names and visible monuments. To erase someone's name and destroy their monuments was to kill them not just physically but metaphysically, to deny them existence in the afterlife and in history. For ancient Egyptians, for whom the preservation of the name was crucial to eternal life, this was the ultimate punishment, annihilation so complete that it was as if one had never existed. But the sun that Akhenaten worshipped continued to rise over the ruins of his city. It illuminated the defaced reliefs and the broken statues. Its light fell on the inscriptions from which his name had been erased. And in a final irony, that same sun would one day illuminate the work of archaeologists who would reverse the ancient erasure, who would read the damaged inscriptions, reconstruct the smashed statues, and bring Akhenaten's story back from the oblivion to which his successors had consigned it. The light was patient, eternal, and ultimately the medium through which memory would be restored. Rediscovery in the modern age. For 3 millennia, Akhenaten remained lost to history. The erasure campaign had succeeded so completely that even scholars of ancient Egypt in the 18th and early 19th centuries knew nothing of him. Then gradually, tantalizingly, fragments of his story began to emerge from the desert sands. The first hints came not from Amarna itself, but from Thebes and other sites, where Akhenaten had left traces before moving to his new capital. European explorers and antiquarians working in Egypt in the early 19th century occasionally encountered inscriptions that puzzled them, cartouches containing names they could not identify, artistic styles that seemed aberrant, references to a deity called the Aten that did not fit into the known Egyptian pantheon. These were glimpses through the gaps in the ancient erasure, evidence that something had been deliberately hidden. The breakthrough came in 1887 with an accidental discovery that would prove to be one of the most important in the history of Egyptology. A local Egyptian woman digging for fertilizer in the ruins at Tel El Amarna, the Arabic name for the site of Akhenaten's capital, unearthed clay tablets inscribed with writing she could not read. These were the Amarna letters, the diplomatic archive of Akhenaten's reign. Initially, their importance was not recognized. Some tablets were damaged or destroyed before scholars realized what had been found. But once their nature was understood, they revolutionized understanding of ancient Near Eastern international relations and provided crucial context for Akhenaten's reign. The discovery of the Amarna letters drew scholarly attention to the site itself. If diplomatic archives had survived there, what else might be found? Excavation began in earnest. In 1891-92, Sir William Flinders Petrie, one of the pioneers of scientific archaeology, conducted systematic excavation at Amarna. His work established the basic layout of the ancient city, identified key buildings, and recovered thousands of artifacts. Petrie recognized that this had been a royal capital briefly occupied during the 18th dynasty, though the full story of Akhenaten's religious revolution had yet to be pieced together. German archaeological teams under Ludwig Borchardt began working at Amarna in the early 20th century, focusing particularly on the residential areas and artisan workshops. On December 6, 1912, Borchardt's team made a discovery that would make Akhenaten's queen a global icon. In the ruins of the sculptor Thutmose's workshop, they found the painted limestone bust of Nefertiti, that masterpiece of ancient portraiture with its elegant features, graceful neck, and strangely modern sensibility. The bust became immediately and enduringly famous, eventually becoming one of the most recognizable artifacts from ancient Egypt, housed today in Berlin's Neues Museum. The discovery and publication of Akhenaten's monument sparked intense scholarly debate. Here was a pharaoh who seemed radically different from others, whose art style broke with millennia of convention, whose theology appeared to anticipate later monotheism. Early interpreters, particularly the American Egyptologist James Henry Breasted, portrayed Akhenaten in heroic terms, as the world's first monotheist, as a spiritual revolutionary, as someone who had achieved an ethical and theological breakthrough that put him ahead of his time. Breasted's 1909 book A History of Egypt presented Akhenaten as a visionary, the first individual in human history, someone who thought independently rather than simply following tradition. This interpretation resonated with early 20th century audiences who valued individualism and religious innovation. Akhenaten became a kind of ancient Egyptian prophet, a voice calling for pure spiritual truth against corrupt priestly power and empty ritual. This romantic view was challenged and complicated by subsequent scholarship, but it established Akhenaten as a figure of enduring fascination. The psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud engaged with Akhenaten's story in his controversial and 39 book Moses and Monotheism, arguing that Moses might have been an Egyptian follower of Akhenaten who transmitted a form of solar monotheism to the Hebrews. Freud's theory lacked historical evidence and was rejected by most scholars, but it demonstrated how Akhenaten's story had captured the modern imagination. Throughout the 20th century, excavation continued at Amarna. British, German, and later other archaeological teams worked to recover and document the ancient city. The excavations revealed the layout of temples, palaces, residential neighbourhoods, and workshops. They recovered countless artefacts: pottery, jewellery, tools, furniture fragments, painted pavements that illuminated daily life during the Amarna period. Scientific techniques like ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery allowed archaeologists to map the ancient city with unprecedented precision. The discovery and reassembly of the Karnak Telatat blocks provided another crucial window into Akhenaten's reign. In the 1960s and 70s, as archaeologists dismantled later constructions at Karnak for restoration, they found tens of thousands of small sandstone blocks decorated with Amarna-style reliefs. These blocks had been taken from Akhenaten's temples and reused as fill. Computer-aided reconstruction efforts gradually pieced together entire wall scenes, revealing the iconographic program of Akhenaten's early Aten temples in remarkable detail. Modern scientific analysis brought new tools to understanding Akhenaten himself. Medical experts examined the artistic representations of his unusual body proportions, debating whether they indicated specific genetic conditions, artistic symbolism, or some combination. CT scans and DNA analysis of royal mummies, including the mysterious body from Cave Ifiv that might be Akhenaten, attempted to establish family relationships and determine causes of death. These investigations raised as many questions as they answered, but they demonstrated how modern science could contribute to ancient historical questions. The scholarly consensus on Akhenaten evolved significantly over the decades. The heroic first monotheist interpretation gave way to more nuanced views that recognized both the innovative and the authoritarian aspects of his reign. Scholars noted that Atenism, while focused on a single deity, still centered worship on the royal family as intermediaries, hardly a democratic or purely spiritual reform. Others pointed out that the Aten cult, far from being a simple rationalistic theology, had its own complex symbolism and ritual requirements. Post-colonial scholarship brought additional perspectives, noting how early European interpretations of Akhenaten reflected the interpreter's own cultural values and assumptions. The portrayal of Akhenaten as an isolated genius battling backward priests echoed colonial narratives about bringing enlightenment to traditional societies. More culturally sensitive approaches tried to understand Akhenaten within his own context, recognizing that concepts like monotheism, developed in later religious traditions, might not perfectly describe his theology. Feminist scholars drew attention to Nefertiti's unusual prominence and questioned earlier assumptions that had minimized her agency. Was she merely Akhenaten's consort following his lead? Or was she a partner in the religious revolution, perhaps even a co-equal ruler? The artistic evidence showed her exercising powers traditionally reserved for pharaohs, suggesting she was more than decorative. The mystery of her later fate, death, disgrace, or transformation into the co-ruler Nefer-Neferuaten, continued to generate theories and debate. Popular culture embraced Akhenaten and Nefertiti enthusiastically. Novels, films, and television programs brought their story to mass audiences, often taking considerable liberties with historical fact. Nefertiti's iconic bust appeared on everything from postage stamps to fashion magazines. Akhenaten became a go-to figure for stories about ancient Egypt's mysteries. The combination of exotic setting, religious revolution, family drama, and mysterious endings made the Amarna period irresistible to storytellers. The modern rediscovery of Akhenaten raised fascinating questions about historical memory and erasure. Here was a case where an ancient civilization had successfully removed a pharaoh from its own historical consciousness, only to have him restored to history by archaeologists 3,000 years later. The ancient Egyptians had tried to destroy Akhenaten's memory. Modern scholarship had resurrected it. The pharaoh whom his successors had deemed unworthy of remembrance had become one of the most studied and discussed figures from ancient Egypt. This resurrection through archaeology demonstrated something profound about the relationship between past and present. History is not simply what happened, but what is remembered, and memory can be manipulated, suppressed, and restored. The ancient Egyptians believed that destroying names and monuments destroyed existence itself, but they underestimated archaeology's future power to read damaged inscriptions, reconstruct broken statues, and piece together deliberately fragmented stories. The sun that Akhenaten worshipped had indeed preserved his story, but not in the way he imagined. His theology promised that living in the Aten's light brought eternal life. Instead, it was the dry Egyptian climate produced by that same sun that preserved the mud, brick, papyrus, paint and stone that would eventually allow scholars to reconstruct his reign. The light he worshipped illuminated, in the end, not divine truth, but archaeological artifacts. It was a different kind of immortality than he had sought, but immortality nonetheless. In museum galleries around the world today, visitors encounter Akhenaten through the fragments that survived ancient destruction and modern excavation. They see his distinctive face in statuary, read his hymns to the Aten, view reconstructions of his temples, marvel at Nefertiti's beauty. They learn about the pharaoh who tried to transform Egyptian religion and who was erased for his efforts, only to return from oblivion 3 millennia later. The story has proven irresistible, because it touches on timeless questions. Can one person change everything? What is the relationship between religious truth and political power? How do we balance innovation with tradition? What happens when vision becomes fanaticism? The modern fascination with Akhenaten says as much about us as about him. We project onto his story our own concerns about religious reform, authoritarian power, artistic innovation, and historical memory. We debate his motives and evaluate his achievements through our own cultural lenses. We make him a hero or a villain, depending on what aspects of his reign we emphasize. In this sense, Akhenaten has achieved a kind of immortality far beyond anything the ancient Egyptians could have imagined. Not as a god or a king, but as an enduring puzzle, a figure whose story we continually retell and reinterpret. Echoes across millennia. The question that has fascinated scholars and general audiences alike since Akhenaten's story was rediscovered is whether his religious revolution had any influence on later monotheistic traditions, particularly Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The similarities are striking enough to demand attention. A single, invisible, universal God, the rejection of other deities as false, an emphasis on divine creation and sustenance of all life, worship based partly on direct experience rather than purely inherited tradition. Could there be a historical connection? The most obvious potential link is chronological and geographical. Akhenaten's reign occurred in the 14th century BCE. Traditional biblical chronology places the Exodus and the formation of early Hebrew monotheism several centuries later, though the exact dating is disputed. Egypt and the land of Canaan, where the Hebrew people emerged, were in close contact during this period. Egyptian imperial control extended over parts of Canaan. There were movements of people, ideas, and cultural influences across these regions. The possibility of some transmission of religious concepts cannot be dismissed out of hand. The parallels between the Great Hymn to the Aten and Psalm 104 are particularly intriguing. Both texts praise a creator deity who makes the sun, or brings forth life, provides for all creatures, and sustains the world moment by moment. The literary structures are similar: catalogues of creation, emphasis on divine beneficence, celebration of the natural order. Some passages seem almost parallel. From the hymn, "When you set in the western horizon, the land is in darkness. At daybreak, when you arise on the horizon, when you shine as the Aten by day, you drive away the darkness." From Psalm 104, "You make darkness, and it is night. When the sun rises, they steal away. O Lord, how manifold are your works! The similarities have led some scholars to propose direct literary influence, suggesting that the Hebrew psalm borrowed from or was inspired by the Egyptian hymn. However, the evidence for such direct transmission is weak. Centuries separate the two texts. No documented mechanism exists by which Egyptian royal hymns would have been transmitted to Hebrew psalmists. More importantly, hymns praising solar deities and creation were common throughout the ancient Near East. Both the Egyptian and Hebrew examples may draw on shared literary conventions rather than one directly influencing the other. The theory that Moses was influenced by, or even was a follower of Akhenaten, popularized by Freud and others, faces even more severe evidentiary problems. There is no reliable historical evidence placing Moses in Egypt during Akhenaten's reign, or any other specific period. The biblical accounts were written down centuries after the events they describe, and disentangling history from theology in these texts is extremely difficult. Most biblical scholars and Egyptologists view the Moses-Akhenaten connection as speculative at best, unsupported by documentary evidence. Yet dismissing any connection whatsoever may be overly cautious. Ideas travel in ways that leave few traces in the archaeological record. Merchants, migrants, mercenaries and refugees moved between Egypt and the Levant. Religious concepts could have been transmitted orally, adapted and transformed in the process. The specific details of Atenism, the worship of the physical sun disk, the royal family as intermediaries, were not transmitted to later monotheisms, but the more abstract idea that there might be only one true God, that other deities were false, that this one God was universal and creator of all, these ideas, revolutionary in Akhenaten's time, appeared again in later traditions. Whether this represents independent development, cultural diffusion, or some combination remains debate. What is clearer is that Atenism and later monotheisms developed different solutions to similar theological problems. How does one reconcile belief in a single, all-powerful, benevolent deity with the evident suffering and evil in the world? Akhenaten's theology, as expressed in the great hymn, emphasized the Aten's universal beneficence and creative power, but did not deeply engage with questions of suffering, death, and evil. Later monotheistic traditions developed elaborate theodicies, explanations of how evil could exist under the rule of an all-good, all-powerful God. The relationship between God, king, and people also evolved differently. In Atenism, the royal family were the exclusive intermediaries between the Aten and humanity. In later Hebrew monotheism, while kings had special status, prophets could speak directly for God, and eventually the tradition developed that all people could have direct relationships with the divine. This democratization of access to God was something Atenism, with its emphasis on the royal family's unique position, never achieved. The ethical dimensions of monotheism also differed. While we should be cautious about claiming any religious tradition as inherently more ethical than others, it is notable that later monotheistic religions developed extensive ethical codes, seeing moral behavior as central to proper worship. The great hymn to the Aten is beautiful but primarily aesthetic and cosmological rather than ethical in its focus. It celebrates creation and divine beauty more than it prescribes moral behavior. This may reflect our incomplete knowledge of Atenist theology. We lack the systematic theological texts that might have addressed ethical questions, but it is a striking difference from how later monotheisms developed. The concept of divine revelation also differed significantly. Akhenaten apparently claimed direct insight into the Aten's nature, based on observation of the sun's role in sustaining life. Later monotheistic traditions typically claimed revelations delivered through specific prophets or events, the giving of the law at Sinai, the revelations to Muhammad, the incarnation in Christian theology. These were understood as interventions of the divine into history, communications from God to humanity. Akhenaten's insight, by contrast, seemed to be more about recognizing what was already evident to anyone who truly observed the sun's power. The fate of these religious systems offers another point of comparison. Atenism died with its founder, erased by his successors, remembered only in fragments until modern archaeology. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam survived persecutions, evolved through centuries, spread across continents, and continue as living traditions today. Why did one fail while others succeeded? The answer is complex, involving historical circumstances, the flexibility of the religious systems themselves, their ability to meet human spiritual and social needs, and perhaps simple historical contingency. One crucial difference was community. The Abrahamic monotheisms developed communal practices, sacred texts, institutional structures, and mechanisms for transmitting tradition across generations. They created not just theology, but lived religion, communities of practice bound together by shared worship, ethical codes, and identity. Atenism, by contrast, remained focused on the royal family and never developed the communal infrastructure that might have sustained it beyond Akhenaten's reign. The question of whether Akhenaten's experiment influenced later monotheisms may ultimately be unanswerable with certainty. What we can say is that he articulated in the 14th century BCE a vision of exclusive monotheism, the idea that only one God exists and all others are false, that would later become central to Abrahamic religions. Whether through direct influence, cultural diffusion, or independent development, the idea appeared and persisted. In this sense, Akhenaten was indeed early, though whether he was first depends on how we define terms and what evidence we credit. More important than the question of influence may be the recognition that Akhenaten's theological revolution represents one moment in humanity's long exploration of how to understand the divine. Different cultures at different times have moved toward or away from monotheism, have emphasized transcendence or immanence, have sought divine presence in nature or beyond it. Akhenaten's move towards solar monotheism was one such exploration, failed in its immediate context but fascinating in retrospect. The echoes we hear across millennia are perhaps less about direct transmission than about recurring patterns in human religious thought. The search for unity behind multiplicity, for simplicity behind complexity, for a single explanation that encompasses all existence, these are persistent human intellectual and spiritual drives. Akhenaten expressed them in one way, in one time and place. Later traditions express them differently in their own times and places. The variations are as important as the similarities, teaching us that monotheism is not a single idea, but a family of related concepts that can be configured in multiple ways. In the end, what links Akhenaten to later monotheisms may be less historical causation than shared human concerns. What is ultimately real? How should we live in relation to the divine? What gives existence meaning and purpose? These questions transcend any particular answer, and the fact that radically different cultures have wrestled with them suggests something fundamental about the human condition. Akhenaten's answers were his own, shaped by Egyptian concepts and his personal vision. But the questions he asked echo still, across the millennia, in every tradition that seeks unity, meaning, and purpose in understanding the divine. The psychology of light. Light occupies a unique position in human consciousness and symbolism, cutting across cultures and spanning the entirety of human history. It is both physical phenomenon and metaphor, both practical necessity and spiritual symbol. To understand Akhenaten's revolution, we must grapple with why light, specifically sunlight, held such power over his imagination and why his theology resonated, even if briefly, with at least some of his contemporaries. From a purely biological perspective, human vision is dominant among our senses. We are visual creatures who orient ourselves primarily through what we see. Light makes vision possible. Without it, we are literally lost in darkness. This fundamental dependence on light for navigating our world creates a natural association between light and knowledge, between darkness and ignorance or danger. The metaphorical use of enlightenment to describe intellectual or spiritual insight, illumination to describe understanding, and darkness to describe confusion or evil, these are not arbitrary but rooted in basic human experience. Sunlight specifically has qualities that make it particularly suited to religious symbolism. It is powerful yet non-threatening when not viewed directly. It returns reliably every morning, offering what must have seemed to ancient peoples like a daily miracle of renewal. It clearly supports life. Plants grow toward it, animals become active in its warmth, humans perform most activities during daylight. In a world without artificial lighting, the difference between day and night was profound, making the sun's departure each evening and return each morning events of genuine significance. The sun is also universal and democratic in its blessings. It shines on everyone regardless of status, ethnicity, or moral worth. This quality made it an attractive symbol for a god who transcended human categories and divisions. Unlike deities associated with particular peoples, places, or functions, the sun could be experienced by all humans everywhere. This universalism was de guerre in the ancient world, where gods were typically understood as having specific jurisdictions and showing preferences for particular peoples or places. Cognitive science offers additional insights into light's symbolic power. The human brain processes visual information about light and dark in regions associated with reward and threat assessment. Bright, well-lit environments generally activate positive responses, while darkness triggers vigilance and anxiety. Evolutionary adaptations that once helped our ancestors avoid nocturnal predators. These deep-seated neural responses give light and darkness their emotional valence, making them potent symbols for good and evil, knowledge and ignorance, safety and danger. The phenomenology of light, how we actually experience it, also matters. Light is immaterial yet powerful, intangible yet undeniably real in its effects. It occupies space yet has no mass. It can be blocked but not grasped. These qualities make it a useful metaphor for divinity, which in many traditions is understood as non-material yet causally efficacious, permeating reality yet not being any particular thing. Akhenaten's focus on the sun disk as a visible manifestation of invisible divine power thus made a kind of intuitive sense. The physical light was real and observable while also pointing towards something transcendent. The simplicity of solar worship also had psychological appeal. Traditional Egyptian religion, with its hundreds of deities, complex mythologies, and elaborate rituals, required extensive knowledge to navigate. Priesthood spent lifetimes mastering the intricacies. For someone seeking a more direct, immediate religious experience, the sun offered elegant simplicity. No mythology to memorize, no complex ritual to perform, just the daily observation of the source of life and acknowledgement of its power. This could be experienced as liberation from excessive complication, a return to essential truth. Yet this same simplicity could also be experienced as impoverishment. Humans seem to need narratives, not just principles. We make sense of the world through stories that explain why things are as they are, that give us models for behavior, that connect past, present, and future. The traditional gods came with elaborate mythologies that performed these functions. Osiris's death and resurrection provided a template for understanding human mortality and the hope for afterlife. Isis's devotion to her husband and son offered models of familial love. Horus's battles against Set represented the eternal struggle between order and chaos. Atenism, by stripping away mythological narrative in favour of pure solar theology, may have been too abstract for most people's religious needs. The great hymn to the Aten is beautiful, but it describes rather than narrates. It says the god creates and sustains, but it offers no stories of how or why, no divine personalities to relate to, no mythological drama that reflects human experience. For a priestly class or philosophical elite, this might have been satisfying. For ordinary people seeking comfort in grief, guidance in moral dilemmas, or hope in suffering, it may have been insufficient. The psychological dimensions of Akhenaten's personal experience deserve consideration. What led this particular individual to fixate on the sun with such intensity that he would upend an entire civilization? While we cannot diagnose historical figures, we can note that his religious preoccupation had features sometimes associated with what modern psychology would call obsessive intensity, the all-consuming focus, the inability to compromise, the conviction that one has access to truth that others cannot see. Was this genuine religious revelation the experience of contact with what Akhenaten understood ultimate reality? Or was it a kind of obsessive fixation that he interpreted as divine inspiration? The distinction may be impossible to make from our historical distance and may not even be meaningful. Religious experience and psychological states are not necessarily separate categories. What we can say is that Akhenaten's certainty about his vision was absolute, and that certainty drove him to actions that most people, before and since, would have considered extreme. The role of trauma in shaping Akhenaten's psychology also invites speculation. Growing up as a spare heir who unexpectedly became crown prince after his older brother's death, possibly suffering from a condition that gave him unusual physical appearance and perhaps chronic health problems, immersed in the political tensions between royal power and priestly authority, all of this may have contributed to a psyche that sought certainty, purity, and control. His religious revolution may have been in part a response to personal psychological needs. The psychology of authoritarianism also illuminates aspects of Akhenaten's reign. His revolution combined utopian vision with coercive enforcement, a pattern familiar from many historical attempts to remake society according to ideological blueprints. The conviction that one possesses absolute truth, that all opposing views are not just wrong but dangerous, that resistance must be crushed for the greater good. These are features of authoritarian movements across history. Akhenaten's monotheism was perhaps history's first example of ideological totalitarianism, however crude by modern standards. Yet we should also consider the psychology of beauty and transcendence. Akhenaten's hymns and the art his reign produced suggest someone capable of profound aesthetic experience, of seeing beauty and meaning in the natural world. The Amana style's attention to realistic detail, its celebration of life's textures and movements, reflects a genuine love of the world as it is. This was not nihilistic destruction, but an attempt, however misguided, to clear away what was seen as false to make room for what was understood as true and beautiful. The interplay between mystical experience and mundane politics is always complex. Akhenaten may have had genuine spiritual insights, moments when observing the sunrise felt like encountering ultimate reality, experiences of unity and meaning that transformed his understanding. But he then had to translate those private, ineffable experiences into public policy, into stone temples and enforced orthodoxy. The gap between mystical experience and religious institution is always problematic, but rarely has it been as dramatic as in Akhenaten's case. Modern psychology of religion recognizes that people have different religious temperaments. Some are drawn to elaborate ritual, mythological richness, and communal practice. Others prefer simplicity, direct experience, and individual understanding. Akhenaten seems to have been firmly in the latter camp, but he tried to impose his temperament on an entire society that included both types. This category error, assuming that what worked for him spiritually would work for everyone, may have been one of his fundamental mistakes. The human need for light, both literal and metaphorical, remains constant across cultures and centuries. We still speak of enlightenment, still use light as a metaphor for knowledge and goodness, still find darkness unsettling. In this sense, Akhenaten was drawing on something universal in human psychology, but he took that universal symbol and tried to make it the only symbol, the exclusive truth, and in doing so he demonstrated the limits of even the most powerful metaphor. Light illuminates, but it also blinds when too bright. The eye accustomed only to brilliant sun cannot see in shadows, and much of human life, necessarily, occurs in the shadows between absolute light and absolute darkness, the sun that never died today. The ruins of Akhenaten lie beneath the Egyptian sun, much as they have for over 3,000 years. The city that Akhenaten built with such fervour that he swore would endure forever, lasted barely a generation before being abandoned. The temples where thousands once gathered to worship the Aten are reduced to foundations and scattered stones. The palaces where the royal family lived and ruled are mud brick ruins. The residential neighbourhoods are traces in the sand, outlines of walls marking where people once lived their daily lives. Yet the site retains a certain power. Stand at Amarna at dawn as the sun breaks over the eastern cliffs, and one can almost understand what Akhenaten saw, what moved him to such revolutionary fervour. The light floods the valley, transforms the desert from grey to gold, brings warmth and visibility where there had been cold and darkness. In that moment, it is possible to feel why someone might worship the sun, might see in it a symbol or manifestation of divine power, might build a religion around the simple fact of light. The boundary stelae remain carved into the cliffs, weathered but still legible, still proclaiming Akhenaten's devotion to the Aten and his determination to build an eternal city. These monuments, meant to last forever, have indeed lasted, but not in the way their creator intended. They survive not as the markers of a thriving religious capital, but as archaeological evidence, clues for scholars trying to reconstruct a failed revolution. They speak, but what they say is not what Akhenaten meant them to say. They testify not to the triumph of his vision, but to its failure and his successors' attempts at erasure. The comparison with other religious sites is instructive. The great temples of Amun at Karnak still stand massive and impressive, continuously used and maintained for millennia. The pyramids at Giza, built more than 1,000 years before Akhenaten, remain among humanity's most iconic monuments. But Akhenaten, the city built to worship the one true God, the capital meant to replace all others, was abandoned within decades and left to the desert. The durability of monuments, it seems, correlates not with theological truth but with continuity of worship and institutional support. Yet in a broader sense, the sun that Akhenaten worshipped has indeed never died. It continues to rise every morning, to cross the sky, to set each evening as it has for billions of years and will continue to do for billions more. It remains the source of all life on Earth, the energy that powers photosynthesis and drives weather patterns and makes existence possible. In this purely physical sense, Akhenaten was not wrong about the sun's fundamental importance. Where he erred was in the meaning he assigned to that importance, the theological structure he built on the foundation of that one true observation. Modern visitors to Amarna come seeking different things. Archaeologists excavate carefully, documenting structures and artifacts, slowly piecing together the material culture of this brief but intense period. Art historians study the distinctive Amarna style, analysing how it departed from tradition and what that departure meant. Historians debate Akhenaten's motivations, his policy's effects, his role in the broader sweep of Egyptian and ancient Near Eastern history. Tourists arrive, cameras in hand, seeking connection to this famous moment in antiquity. What each finds is shaped by what they bring. Those seeking a hero find evidence of visionary courage, of someone willing to challenge the establishment and think independently. Those seeking a cautionary tale find evidence of fanaticism, of how certainty can become tyranny, of the dangers of imposing one person's vision on an entire society. Those seeking religious meaning find questions about monotheism's origins and the relationship between human religious ideas and ultimate truth. Those seeking simply to understand the past find a complex, fascinating moment when everything was in flux, and outcomes were uncertain. The physical sun, of course, cares nothing for any of this. It is a ball of plasma, converting hydrogen to helium through nuclear fusion, radiating energy into space according to the laws of physics. It has no consciousness, no intentions, no interest in whether humans worship it or study it or simply take it for granted. The meaning Akhenaten saw in the sun was projected onto it, not inherent in it. The theology he built was a human construction, however inspired he felt it to be, and yet there is something profound in the simple fact of the sun's constancy. It has outlasted pharaohs and empires, religions and ideologies, all of human history and prehistory. It will outlast us all. When Akhenaten was being built, the sun was shining. When the city was abandoned, the sun continued shining. When it was buried in sand and forgotten, the sun still rose. When it was rediscovered and excavated, the sun illuminated the work. And when someday all human civilization has passed and Earth itself is lifeless, the sun will continue shining, at least until it exhausts its fuel billions of years hence. This cosmic indifference might seem to render human religious efforts meaningless. What does it matter what we believe about the sun when the sun itself neither knows nor cares? But perhaps the question is wrong. Perhaps meaning exists not in the objects we contemplate, but in the contemplation itself, in the human struggle to make sense of existence, to find purpose and pattern in the universe, to relate ourselves to something larger than our individual lives. Akhenaten's revolution failed by every practical measure. His god was abandoned, his city deserted, his memory erased, his dynasty ended. Within a generation it was as if he had never existed. But his questions persist. What is ultimately real? How should we live in relation to the cosmos? What gives existence meaning? These questions outlived their questioner by millennia and will outlive us all. The answers change, but the questions remain. The sun rises each morning over the ruins of Amarna, its rays touching the broken stones just as they once touched the living city. The Aten, as Akhenaten understood it, gives light without judgment, without favourites, without concern for who worships or how. This impartiality, which Akhenaten saw as divine perfection, can also be read as simple physical causation. The sun shines because nuclear fusion releases energy, not because of any intentional care. But perhaps there is a third way to understand it. Perhaps the sun's constancy, its reliable return each dawn and its indifferent blessing on all beneath it, does offer a kind of meaning, not theological meaning imposed from above, but existential meaning found in the simple fact of existence, of continuity, of the universe's basic reliability. The sun rises tomorrow because it rose today, because the laws of physics are constant, because there is an order to things that transcends human wishes and human plans. Akhenaten built his theology on an observation of nature. The sun rises, gives life, sets, rises again. This observation was and remains true. Where he went wrong was perhaps not in the observation, but in the elaboration, in the attempt to construct from one true observation an entire system of theology, politics, and social control. The gap between the sun gives life, and therefore we must tear down all temples to all other gods and build a new capital devoted only to the sun disk, is vast, and bridging it requires more than observation. It requires interpretation, choice, the imposition of human meaning on natural fact. Every religion faces this challenge: how to move from observed reality to prescribed belief and practice, how to get from is to ought, how to construct meaning in a universe that offers facts but not values. Akhenaten's answer was direct and simple: observe the sun's power, worship it as the sole deity, live in its light. That this answer proved inadequate for most Egyptians, that it failed to meet the complex needs human religion must address, that it was abandoned almost as soon as its creator died. All this suggests that simplicity, however elegant, is not always sufficient. The desert wind blows across Amarna's ruins as it has blown for centuries. Sand shifts and drifts, slowly burying what archaeologists have exposed, requiring constant work to maintain access to the ancient city. The sun bleaches the stones, its same rays that once illuminated a living capital, now illuminating only scattered remains. And in this there is perhaps a final lesson, that all human constructions are temporary. All certainties eventually crumble, all visions fade. Only the sun itself remains constant, rising and setting, indifferent and eternal, illuminating without judging, giving light to wisdom and folly alike. Perhaps Akhenaten in his own way understood this. Perhaps his insistence on the Atene's eternity was recognition that only the physical sun endures, while all human interpretations of it pass away. Perhaps he knew his revolution would fail but believed in proclaiming it anyway, because the truth he had perceived, however imperfectly expressed, however badly implemented, was worth stating even if it could not be sustained. Or perhaps he died believing he had succeeded, believing his city would stand forever, his God would be worshipped eternally, and his name would live through all generations. We cannot know. What we can know is that the sun rose this morning over Amana, as it does every morning, as it will tomorrow, and for billions of tomorrows more. It shines on archaeologists' tents and tourists' cameras, on broken stones and sandy foundations, on the cliffs where boundary stelae still proclaim an abandoned faith. It shines, as Akhenaten said, on all lands, all peoples, all life. In this, at least, the heretic Pharaoh was not wrong. The sun that never died continues its ancient journey, lighting the world with the same impartial radiance it offered to the Pharaoh who tried to remake civilization in its image. The light remains. The meaning we make of it, that is, was and always will be our task, our burden, and perhaps our glory.